The night is quiet now. The world outside has slowed, and you are here, resting in the stillness, listening to a story that has been whispered across centuries. Imagine the sky above you, scattered with stars, a gentle hush moving through the air. In this silence, your heart opens, ready to receive something timeless. Tonight, we will walk together into a story that carries both sorrow and hope, a story of a man who stepped beyond death itself. What if death was not the end? What if the silence of the grave was not the final word? That question, so vast and unshakable, has lingered in every human heart since the beginning of time. It is a question whispered in hospital corridors, a question that follows the quiet tears of grief, and a question that trembles on the lips of those who have lost someone they loved. This story of Lazarus does not merely speak to the past. It speaks to every one of us who has ever wondered whether the final goodbye is truly final. Close your eyes for a moment and let the ancient world unfold around you. Stone streets warmed by the sun, narrow paths winding between olive trees, and a small village called Bethany resting on the slopes near Jerusalem. Here lived 3 siblings, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. They were ordinary people, living ordinary days. They cooked, they prayed, they laughed, they wept. Yet within their home, there was something extraordinary, a friendship with Jesus, the teacher who carried compassion in his eyes and spoke words that touched the soul like cool water on a thirsty tongue. Pause for a moment and ask yourself, what does it mean to be known by name, to be loved deeply, not for power or fame, but for who you are? That was the bond Lazarus shared with Jesus. In the simplicity of Bethany, in the quiet rhythms of family life, there was a closeness that went beyond words, but even in such closeness, shadows fall. And the shadow that none of us can escape illness. Weakness, the slow fading of breath, entered the home of Lazarus. The story begins in the most human of ways, with worry, with whispers around a bedside, with the silent prayers of sisters watching someone they love slipping away. This is where the story touches us, not as distant listeners, but as fellow travelers. Because who among us has not sat in that same place? Who has not waited by the side of someone they love, watching with helpless hope, wishing that health would return, praying for time to stretch a little longer? The pain of that waiting, the ache of that helplessness, it belongs to every heart. And it is here, in this very ache, that the story of Lazarus opens like a door into something greater. Think of it this way. Stories survive for thousands of years, not just because they happened, but because they keep happening. They echo. They speak again and again into new lives, new sorrows, new questions. The story of Lazarus has lived this long because it speaks into the silence of every hospital room, every mourning household, every place where hope feels too fragile to hold. As you listen tonight, let the rhythm of the words carry you gently, like a calm river flowing at dusk. This is not just history, it is reflection. It is not only about them, it is about us. In Lazarus, we see our own mortality. In his sisters, we see our own longing. In Jesus, we see the possibility of love that even death cannot extinguish. And so, the invitation is before you. Rest here in this story. Let your heart breathe in its ancient comfort. Let your soul lean on its quiet strength. Allow yourself to wonder, to hope, to feel deeply, yet also to relax as the night holds you. For just as the stars above seem endless, so too is the mystery. of life, loss, and what may come after. Before we continue further, I want to pause and ask you to join me in something small but meaningful. If you're finding peace in these words, if this story is already stirring something in your heart, I invite you to subscribe to this channel so that more nights can be filled with gentle stories like this one. And I'd love to know where. Are you listening from tonight? Which city do you call home? And what time of night or day are you hearing these words? Share your name and city in the comments so that this story connects not just to the past, but also to the living present. Through you, Dot, and with that quiet invitation, we step softly into Bethany, where shadows are gathering and where love will meet death face to face. Olive groves soften the village's edges as it sits in a peaceful valley, glistening like silver-green waves in the late sunlight. The scent of herbs wafts from tiny gardens tended by grizzled hands, and shepherds lead their flocks along narrow paths of weathered stone that wane through fields. Bethany is a place of simple beauty rather than grandeur, where the people of Bethany bear the weight of history in a subtle and nearly imperceptible way. Here, life is slow. The roosters call and the rustle of women carrying jars to the well signal the start of the morning. The rhythm of trade, children playing, and men congregating in shady courtyards to exchange stories and bread makes the afternoons drag on. And as night falls, one by one, lamps in the windows begin to flicker softly until the entire village is enveloped in a blanket of flickering light. A house that accepts everyone without conditions is at the center of Bethany. Its walls aren't high or intimidating, but something uncommon, the warmth of true love, resides within them. Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus reside here. The aroma of freshly baked bread, the sound of soft conversation, and the sense that you belong here are all welcome when you enter. Although their family is not wealthy or powerful, they are well known in Bethany for their generosity. Martha's attention to detail in making sure every guest is fed. Mary's ability to listen with the composure of someone who knows the importance of words, and Lazarus's ability to carry laughter in his voice that fills the room and lasts long after it has faded. The quiet one is Mary. Her soul seems to absorb life like a sponge, clinging to special moments as if they were priceless possessions that would be irreplaceable. She has soft hands and a soft voice, but her eyes, they have a depth that comes from seeing what others might miss. She recalls the little things, like the way someone's shoulders tilt when they're tired, the way a voice that's filled with sorrow trembles, and the beauty of light falling at dusk across a wall. Sitting next to Mary is a way to feel seen, not in a demanding way, but in a way that lessens the weight of being invisible. Her sister Martha is unique, the one whose footsteps never seem to stop moving. She is the household strength. Martha listens where Mary does. She gets up before the sun to tend to the bread, make oil, and organize things so that her guests, family, and village can continue without any problems. But beneath that boundless energy is a heart full of intense love. When she senses that something is going wrong, she may fuss, correct, or reprimand, but it all stems from the same source as her labor, devotion. Her love is firm and steady, the kind that keeps a house together when everything else seems to be crumbling. It is not as gentle as Mary's. Lazarus comes next. He is remembered for something more uncommon, a spirit of ease, joy, and belonging, rather than for his sermons or wealth. He exudes a sense of lightness, as if he understands how to be in the middle of life without having to exert any control. When he walks through the village, children rush to him, grabbing his hands and pleading for laughter or stories. Lazarus has a way of making ordinary moments extraordinary, so friends end up staying at his table longer than they had planned. His soul serves as a reminder of what it means to be alive. The three of them create a home that is more akin to a haven than a typical residence. Beyond their door lies the harsh reality of poverty and illness, the weight of Rome's taxes, and the murmur of political unrest. But there's something indestructible within their walls. They serve as a reminder to the village and maybe to themselves that love can be strong enough to bear the weight of life. Take a moment to picture yourself standing on the walkway right outside their door. As the sound of grain grinding fills the air, you hear Martha's warm but brisk voice calling out instructions from the kitchen. Mary's song rises and falls like the wind through olive branches as you hear her humming softly to herself. And Lazarus laughs somewhere close by, the kind of laugh that erases the problems that brought you to this point. The soul of Bethany is shown in these fleeting moments, not in its streets or its stones, but in the lives of its residents. Every onlooker can see the closeness between these siblings. Together, they are living in a rhythm that feels complete, rather than just getting by. During the evenings, when bread is shared and lamps are lit, neighbors lean in through the open doorway and are warmly received. They sing songs, whisper prayers, and share stories. Being close to them gives one the impression that family is about more than just blood. It's also about presence, the simple act of sharing a common bond. But beneath this peaceful existence, there is always the awareness that happiness and sadness coexist. Death is nothing new to Bethany. Stone hillsides are engraved with graves, and families are familiar with both the sound of celebration and mourning. This fact adds to the value of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus' love, because they recognize how fleeting life can be. They laugh a little harder and hold each other a little closer. You can practically see the three siblings huddled together in the faint lamplight as the olive groves grow darker beneath the setting sun and the final tasks of the day draw to a close. Bread is placed on the table by Martha. Mary hears her brother speak and remembers what he says, just as she remembers every moment that passes. The comfort of being loved, known, and at home makes Lazarus smile as he leans back. And change is undoubtedly coming from somewhere beyond the hills. The home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus had a unique warmth that extended beyond familial bonds and toward Jesus of Nazareth, the one who frequently entered their doors. He frequently traveled through crowded cities and villages where he was called by heavy voices and urgent needs from all sides. But he discovered something uncommon in Bethany. He got some rest. Their house served as a haven for his heart, as well as a place to hide from the street. Here, in this home, he was just a friend, welcomed without expectation, even though his feet were covered in dirt from long journeys. His voice was hoarse from teaching, and his spirit was burdened by the innumerable souls that pressed upon him with needs and questions. Jesus and this family became friends out of love, not obligation. Lazarus provided him with companionship that demanded nothing in return, thanks to his easy laughter and steady demeanor. Busy and alert, Martha made sure he was taken care of, that food was set in front of him, and that her assistance relieved his fatigue. Mary, seated at his feet, took in every word as someone who found life in his voice rather than as a student striving for knowledge. Together, they provided him with something that few others could, a home, not as a rabbi or a magician, but as a cherished friend. Their evenings together were characterized by the everyday, beauty of life rather than spectacle. Imagine bread being broken by hand and dipped in herb-scented oil, the soft glow of oil lamps and shadows dancing on plastered walls. Martha's footsteps reverberated from the kitchen as she yelled, "Eat more, rest longer." Lazarus would recline and narrate tales of the village and neighbors, maybe giggling over trivial events that had no significance beyond their home, but brought joy to the gathering. And there, in the middle, was Jesus, his eyes gleaming with both human joy and divine light, his laughter joining theirs. They had nothing to brag about, so their hospitality was not based on wealth. Its foundation was love, the kind of love that flows freely and without calculation. He gave them presents, and they gave him bread. They listened to him, and he spoke to them in a way that fed their hearts. Like water flowing into water, the giving and receiving between them was balanced. There was no implicit expectation, no feeling of debt. There was only genuine, enduring friendship. For Jesus, who frequently passed through crowds that misinterpreted him and whose closest followers occasionally failed to understand his heart, Bethany was a place where he was accepted without question or opposition. Jesus was more than just the prophesied Messiah that synagogues whispered about to Lazarus and his sisters. He was their friend, the one who sat at their table as if he had always been there, who laughed at their jokes and who knew their stories. It came naturally to them to love him, and they found that he greatly valued their lives in return. You can practically see Mary's face as she sat close to him, her eyes silently devoted to him. She was just taking in his words as if they were water on a day when she was thirsty, not getting bogged down in arguments or the workings of the law. Even though she was frequently preoccupied with her work, Martha had a love that was equally profound and manifested through her service. And Lazarus, calm and gentle, greeted Jesus with a friendship that didn't need words. Silence was as natural to them as talking. The weight of the world seemed to stop in Bethany. Outside the walls, there were still the sounds of warring empires, the whispers of religious authorities, and the exhaustion of human misery. But there was calm within. Jesus' presence illuminated the house rather than cast a shadow over it. His presence seemed to deepen the breath in every part of the house. The prayers were more personal, the silences more revered, the laughter fuller. His friendship sanctified the commonplace rather than calling for the extraordinary. Because of their love for him, it was evident to those who knew them that this family was unique. The relationship was neither casual nor transient. It was the sort of friendship that became ingrained in memory, one that was so powerful that rumors of it circulated throughout the village. When they saw him coming, children might have pointed and said, "There is the teacher who stays with Lazarus." It's possible that neighbors noticed their unique and lovely bond and smiled knowingly. The three siblings undoubtedly sensed the emptiness of his chair and the silence where his laughter had once filled the room when he was gone. Being known is at the heart of friendship. And in this family, Jesus was known as more than just Lord or teacher. He was known as friend. Their affection for him was intimate and was based on shared hours, broken bread, and entwined lives rather than miracles. Furthermore, the Bible would later refer to Lazarus as the one whom Jesus loved. because of how deeply he loved them. It was a tender love that hurts when separation occurs, not a formal, far-off one. Knowing that there was laughter around a table, the coziness of a fire, and the sense of belonging before the miracle. The sorrow and the tomb is a silent beauty. These moments of friendship are at the core of the larger narrative, not merely supporting characters. What could be more miraculous than love that unites people? Love that invites the Creator into the home of His creation as a friend seeking companionship rather than as a master demanding service? You can practically hear the soft murmur of their voices as night falls over Bethany, see the street lit by lamplight spilling into it, and sense the tranquility that emanates from those walls. The fact that Lazarus's name was already engraved on his friend's heart long before it was spoken into existence again can be found somewhere in that tranquility. Like so many trials in life, it started out quietly, almost imperceptibly. It might have been a cough that persisted longer than anticipated, or a physical fatigue that Lazarus couldn't seem to get rid of with rest. Mary and Martha initially dismissed it, convincing themselves that their brother was resilient and that his body would undoubtedly heal. However, as the days went by, the specters of sickness started to spread throughout their house. There was now a hint of concern in what had once been a place of laughter and calm. Every step Martha took felt heavier in the cramped rooms, and every look Mary cast at her brother was tinged with a silent terror. She dared not mention Dot in homes affected by illness. There is a hush that is only broken by the sound of labored breathing, the faint murmur of prayers, or the frantic movements of people who are desperately trying to assist. That silence deepened in Bethany every day. Lazarus's once steady voice, which had brought stories and laughter to their evenings, grew weaker and eventually faded into whispers. His physical strength, which had supported them during numerous tasks, now appeared to be weak, burdened by an invisible force. There were now shadows of pain in his eyes, which had once been bright with the consolation of friendship. Ever perceptive of the heart, Mary would sit near him, her hands lightly touching his, as though her touch could bring him back to reality. Her voice was trembling but steady with faith as she recited psalm verses and whispered encouraging words. "Lord, heal him," she prayed in the silence of her heart, her prayers rising like incense. "Don't let this shadow take him away from us, Lord." Her soul shook with fear, even though her voice did not tremble out loud. Martha put in a lot of work because she was a practical person. She did everything her hands could do, including gathering water, mixing herbs, and asking neighbors for remedies. For Martha, love was demonstrated in action, and she resisted giving up her power. However, the sickness clung to him, tightening its hold. Regardless of what she prepared or how frequently she checked his forehead, she would fall into prayer at night when she was exhausted and her body hurt from running back and forth, muttering, "Jesus, if only you were here, you would know what to do." Even though he was weak, Lazarus must have felt the strain of his sister's anxiety. Maybe in brief flashes of insight, he tried to lighten their load by smiling. "Do not fear, sisters, I will be well," he may have whispered, although his tone revealed his own hesitancy. Because when the frailty of illness touches even the strongest of men, the thought of, "What if this is the end?" haunts them. The locals started to take notice. The evening breeze carried whispers through Bethany. "Lazarus is not feeling well." Some shook their heads, remembering how close Jesus was to this family. Others questioned why the teacher was absent, and why his beloved friend had not yet been visited by the one who healed strangers. Mary and Martha struggled with the same question inside that tiny house. Why hadn't he arrived? When they needed him most, why hadn't their friend, the person they trusted more than life itself, showed up? The hardest times were at night. Oil lamps flickered, shadows stretched, and the quiet of sickness became loud. Mary prayed that it wouldn't be her brother's last breath as she sat awake, listening to everyone. Martha frequently got up to check his temperature, bring water, and adjust his blanket. They slept in short bursts out of fear of what they would find when they woke up. They clung to the tenuous thread that Lazarus would recover, living in the liminal space between hope and despair. A bitter companion is helplessness. It infiltrates when all human endeavors are unsuccessful, when prayers appear to go unanswered, and when one's strength is insufficient to withstand the storm. And there was a strong sense of helplessness in that house. Mary silently shed tears as she prayed. Once steady during labor, Martha's hands shook while she worked. Lazarus fought a battle that neither of his sisters could join while he was battling, a fever that came and went. Nevertheless, they held fast to the one certainty that they had a friend that was unlike anyone else. Indeed, if Jesus knew, if he arrived, this illness would not result in death. He was the one who healed the lame, who opened the eyes of the blind, and who spoke life where none existed. "Lord, the one you love is sick," they cried, sending a message across the distance with shaky but alive hope. Words that are straightforward but laden with all of their faith and fear. They thought he would come when he heard. Waiting is a trial in and of itself. Every hour felt like a day, and every moment seemed longer than the one before it. In an effort to keep her head clear, Martha busied herself making food that Lazarus was unable to eat, rearranging his bed, and pacing close to the doorway. Mary remained near her brother, praying, listening, and observing the rise and fall of his chest as if her eyes were enough to keep him alive. "He will come," they reassured each other quietly. "He cares for us. Lazarus is the object of his affection. He won't abandon us in this manner." But even as they spoke, a subtle but piercing doubt began to creep in. What if he takes his time? What happens if he is late? What if their hope is outweighed by this illness? During those times, faith served as both their compass and their obstacle. Because faith is the ability to persevere in the face of fear, not the absence of it. The truth of their powerlessness became more apparent as the days turned into nights and the shadows grew deeper around their house. They had done everything they could. They had hoped, worked, and prayed. However, Lazarus's breathing became shallow as his body weakened. The frail thread of his life now centered the sisters' world, which had once been full of light and laughter. They had no choice but to wait for their friend's footsteps, for the miracle they so desperately desired, and for a response to the silent question that pervaded the atmosphere. What if death was nearer than life? It was not a hasty decision to send the message. Every word had weight in their world, and every act of outreach contained the heart's trembling. With their brother's frail body close by, Mary and Martha stood side by side in the silence of their house, realizing they could no longer bear the weight alone. It was Martha who spoke first, always the first to act. "We have to tell him," she stated in a steady yet low voice. Because she knew deep down that Jesus was not just their teacher, but also their friend and their only hope. Mary nodded, her eyes sparkling with unshed tears. They framed their request in straightforward terms. "Lord, the one you love is ill." The message was brief and devoid of long explanations or frantic arguments. It contained no specific instructions or demands on what he had to do. Rather, it was molded by trust, by silent faith that he would comprehend without further explanation. They didn't write, "Heal him now" or "Come quickly." They merely expressed the reality of their suffering and let him decide how to respond. Both human helplessness and unwavering belief were present in that brief sentence. They trusted his love and knew his heart, carrying not only words, but also the burden of their hope. The messenger set out on the dusty road. Mary hovered at Lazarus' side behind him, whispering softly that assistance was on its way as her fingers brushed over her brother's hand. As if her efforts could stabilize the world until Jesus came, Martha busied herself again, making broth he was unable to drink and smoothing his bed linens. In their own ways, both sisters rooted themselves in the conviction that their friend would not overlook them. Furthermore, isn't there something profoundly poignant about the wording they used in their message? "The person you care about is ill." They didn't remind him of what they had previously done for him, nor did they make a plea based on their loyalty. They just relied on his affection. It was about his heart, not their deservingness. They believed that his love for Lazarus was sufficient justification for his action. How often do we overcomplicate our own prayers with lengthy justifications, forgetting that sometimes the current of love only needs to be carried by a whisper of need? Maybe Mary and Martha thought about how Jesus would respond if he heard as the messenger traveled. They imagined him halting in his tracks and turning to face Bethany with haste. They imagined him coming quickly and bringing comfort to their house. They clung to the memory of his miracles, the bleeding woman who was healed by the mere touch of his garment, the blind who were now able to see, and the lame who were able to walk. They recalled his words, his tenderness, and the power that seemed to come naturally to him. They reasoned that he would not allow death to have the last say in Lazarus' life. However, the hours passed after the messenger departed, and the sisters were once more ensnared in the precarious cycle of waiting. Since waiting requires faith in what we believe to be true rather than what we can see, it is frequently the most challenging act of faith. The only sounds coming from the house were their brother's labored breathing and the crackle of the oil lamp. Even though she knew it would be a while before she saw him, Martha paced close to the doorway and looked around the street. With each ragged breath her brother took, Mary's heart rose and fell as she stayed by Lazarus, praying in silence. Their minds must have been filled with memories while they waited. Maybe they recalled the evenings when Jesus had sat at their table, his laughter resonating throughout the rooms, his presence elevating the commonplace to the sacred. They recalled his lessons and how he described life as something much bigger than what the human eye could perceive. They recalled the intense love that seemed to pierce right through the soul that was in his eyes. Their faith was strengthened by all of these memories, which kept them steadfast, even as fear increased. It is important to note that their message was one of hope rather than despair. They reached out because they had enough faith in him. They trusted that he would listen because they had enough faith in his love. They chose hope over silence, even as Lazarus' strength diminished and their own hearts shook. That act demonstrates a quiet courage that dares to believe in something greater than suffering while acknowledging its existence. Their remarks serve as a reminder that faith is not always loud. On occasion, it is a whisper that is sent across the miles, brittle but unwavering. Thus, under the same sun that scorched Bethany, the messenger carried their request across the valleys and hills. He was moving closer to the friend who was the source of their hope with each step. Did he hurry because he could feel the sisters' hearts were racing? Did he take a moment to rest, muttering the message to himself to help him remember? In their faith, the sisters knew that a single word from Jesus could change everything. So with every mile, the gap between comfort and despair seemed both beautifully short and unbearably long. At home, the sisters did their best to cling to their faith. Martha's eyes showed her concern, but her hands remained busy. Despite her silent tears, Mary remained hopeful. Their hearts were united in the conviction that their friend would not desert them, and together they bore the burden of waiting. There was also a light, faint, flickering, but real, that came from their trust, even though the shadows of illness still hung heavy in the room. Because they had done what their faith required of them, they had trusted, they had asked, and now they would wait. The beauty of their hope is most evident here in this waiting. Hope stabilizes the soul during a storm, but it does not take away suffering. Hope keeps the heart from sinking into despair, even though it doesn't always provide instant answers. In their letter to Jesus, Mary and Martha made the decision to trust that love outweighed sickness and that their friend was looking out for them. Even though they could not yet hear his footsteps on the street, they repeatedly told themselves, "The one you love is sick, and he will come." And it was that straightforward, frail, unwavering faith that got them through the darkest nights. He had received the message, the simple yet tremblingly urgent words, "Lord, the one you love is sick," conveyed the pain of two sisters and the weight of their brittle hope. To the surprise of everyone around him, Jesus did not get up and run to Bethany right away. Rather, he stayed put, lingering for 2 more days. The story unfolds into one of the most puzzling mysteries of faith, the waiting at this point in time. Consider the disciples' silent uneasiness. They had previously witnessed his kindness, his ability to act quickly in response to the cries of the wounded, and his willingness to treat strangers in large groups. How much more would he rush to see his beloved friend Lazarus? Jesus, however, spoke words that seemed to go well beyond the present and gazed at them with serene assurance. "This illness will not result in death," he said quietly, assurance and sadness in his eyes. "It is for the glory of God in order to exalt God's Son." His words were veiled in mystery for those who heard them. Why wait if Lazarus was really his beloved? There's always a weight to waiting, isn't there? Slowly, the hours pass, each one laden with anticipation. Those 2 days must have seemed like a lifetime to Mary and Martha. With the hope that Jesus would not reject them, they had sent their request. However, the silence of unresolved longing pressed in as they watched over Lazarus, as the color faded from his face and his breathing became shallower. Perhaps a glimmer of hope was sparked. By each creak of the door and each shadow at the window, was he present? Had he arrived? But the hours passed, and the road was still deserted. Waiting causes a kind of agony that pierces the soul. The storm of questions it raises is just as painful as the delay itself. Are we as important as we think we are? Has anyone heard our cry? Is assistance still on the way, or have we been abandoned? It's possible that Martha pressed these doubts down with her busy hands while Mary whispered them in her heart. Both sisters experienced the conflict between faith and grief, belief and longing. After all, waiting puts our patience and faith in hidden motives to the test. However, what appeared to be absence was actually a component of something bigger. Jesus didn't wait because he was careless or unconcerned. His heart was completely with them in their sorrow, more tender than theirs could ever be. He loved Mary and Martha just as much as he loved Lazarus. His love grew stronger as a result of the waiting, not diminished, because a greater glory that would last for generations was being prepared during the delay. Love sometimes takes its time because it is creating something bigger than ourselves. Faith learns to breathe differently in the silence of waiting. It depends on trust that goes beyond what is visible rather than what is visible to the naked eye. In those days, Mary and Martha's faith was being molded like delicate clay. With good reason, they had thought Jesus could heal their brother. However, their faith was now being expanded to include the conviction that his power was unconstrained by death or even by time. Even though it was bitter, waiting was preparing them for a revelation they were not yet ready to accept. That pain, the unanswered prayer, the silence after frantic words whispered in the night may be familiar to you as well. Waiting is like being in a long hallway with all the doors closed and footsteps resonating but no one turning the knob. Although it may seem like abandonment, it is frequently a pause with a deeper meaning. What if God is preparing rather than withholding during this waiting period? What if the postponement isn't a rejection but rather the beginning of something more amazing than we could have imagined? Sitting close to Jesus at the time, the disciples undoubtedly struggled with bewilderment. They might have questioned whether he had misinterpreted the urgency after witnessing his tranquility and unhurried calm. He taught them, however, that faith is about resting in the assurance of God's timing rather than hurrying. They were still unaware that the very delay that they found problematic would eventually be the source of their greatest wonder. The thread that would connect their everyday faith to extraordinary wonder was waiting. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus's house in Bethany had become quiet. The smell of oil lamps and the sound of labored breathing filled the air. Holding on to the hope that their friend was on his way, the sisters leaned in close to their brother and whispered consolation. But the silence of his absence grew heavier by the hour. The mystery of waiting is that it asks us to believe in love when it seems far away, to trust when it seems impossible, and to put our faith in a promise even when it hasn't materialized. Yet, Jesus, however, was not unaffected by their suffering during those 2 days. While he waited, he was bringing the desires of heaven and earth into harmony. The purpose of the delay was to raise their hope above the boundaries they had set. For him not to dash it, they thought he could cure illnesses. They would soon discover that he had the power to bring death back to life. They would never have understood the breadth of his love or the extent of his power if they hadn't waited. Thus, we see that even though waiting is unpleasant, there may be a hidden kindness involved, because it teaches us to let go of our own timelines and entrust our shaking hands to someone who has a wider perspective than we do. Waiting was not in vain for Mary and Martha. We don't have either. When held in his love, the silence, despite its weight, is never empty. Although it might seem like absence, it is frequently a prelude to an unspoken glory. In Bethany, 2 days might have seemed endless. For hearts that were already breaking, 2 days might have felt cruel. However, heaven was at work during those 2 days, setting up an event that would forever alter our perception of life and death. He had not forgotten just because he waited. It implied that the story was still being written and that there would be more wonder in its conclusion than the sisters, the disciples, or anyone else who waited could have ever dreamed. After the waiting period was over, Jesus finally got up with a silent determination. The air changed in that moment because those listening understood what such a journey meant. He turned to his disciples and said, "Let us go to Judea again." This was the statement that would set them all on the path to Bethany. Bethany was near Jerusalem, where there was a lot of resistance and constant rumors of danger. Returning was a journey of risk, faith, and trust in something greater than fear in addition to the miles traveled. Though their hearts were torn between fear and loyalty, the disciples followed despite their uncomfortable looks. The road in front of them wound through valleys and hills like a ribbon of earth. Beneath their sandals, dust rose gently, blending with the morning's golden light, as though creation itself was aware that something holy was taking place. The landscapes appeared to breathe in silence. The hillsides were covered with olive groves, their leaves glistening in the wind like silver. The slopes were lined with vineyards, their tendrils curling as if they too were leaning forward in expectation. Delicate and invisible, wildflowers carried their subtle beauty into the journey as they peered through stones along the path. The group frequently walked in silence. Every disciple had his own thoughts, some about Mary and Martha, some about Lazarus, and some about the perils that lay ahead. In addition to dust, there were many questions along the way. Ever direct, Thomas finally said what many were thinking. "Rabbi, are you going there again? The Jews were just trying to stone you." His candid and incisive remarks, which served as a warning of the dangers that awaited, lingered in the air. Jesus' response, however, was both mysterious and comforting. Are there not 12 hours in the day? His meaning went beyond the path beneath their feet. If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. He was reminding them that no darkness could defeat him as long as he walked in accordance with his Father's will. Traveling slows the heart into introspection for some reason. The disciples struggled with the burden of their thoughts as they traveled each mile. Ever fearless, Peter might have approached Jesus more closely, uncertain but protective. Perhaps because his heart was tuned to the mystery of his words, John, the cherished disciple, remained silent. It's possible that Matthew studied the terrain, measuring distances as if they could help the unsteady. And in the middle of all of them, Jesus walked with a composure that dispelled their anxieties, each step and pause deliberate. Before descending into valleys where streams trickled over stones, the road wound upward into ridges. The cries of birds above blended with the sound of the water. With their voices echoing in the wind, shepherds led their flocks over far-off hills, unaware that the very one who breathed life into the earth was walking by. Farmers knelt down in their fields, their hands steady in the dirt. Even as the extraordinary got closer with every step, life continued to move in its usual rhythm. Disciples were whispering to each other. They talked about Lazarus and the Bethany house where they had been greeted with warm bread and open arms. They recalled Mary's quiet devotion while sitting at Jesus' feet, Martha's busy caregiving, and her resolve to serve every guest. The thought of their loss weighed heavily, But these were not strangers. They were family in love. Some people openly questioned why Jesus had waited. Others kept their questions to themselves because they were too sensitive to express them. Jesus occasionally broke the silence with remarks that caused both confusion and consolation. "Our friend Lazarus has gone to sleep," he stated in a firm and confident tone. For a moment, the disciples felt relief. Sleep sounded tender, reversible, and hopeful. Then, however, he made it clear with sorrow, "Lazarus is dead. In order for you to believe, I am also happy that I was not present, but let us go to him." His words were full of pain and promise, a reality that would only become clear when the trip was over. The journey was no longer just about Lazarus. When Thomas, with a bravery derived more from loyalty than confidence, uttered the words that would inspire them to continue, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." It was about following Jesus wherever he went, even into the unknown and the shadow of danger. They walked faster, not because they were less afraid, but because they were driven by love. The path became warmer underfoot as the sun rose higher. The hills gave way to valleys with palms whispering in the wind and fig trees stretching their branches. Along the way, the disciples drew water from a well, and the coolness provided momentary respite from the heat. Their meal was basic but adequate. They shared bread from their packs. Children played and laughed close to the village gates all around them, unaffected by the burden the travelers bore. To the outside world, life appeared normal, but to those who followed Jesus, each step had significance. The trip continued into the evening, and as the light grew softer, the fields were covered in shadows. As the first stars pricked the sky, the disciples saw the sky paint itself in shades of violet and gold. The road had a somber beauty that served as a reminder that creation spoke of God's steadfast hand, even in the face of uncertainty. Jesus walked in the middle, and his presence served as the stabilizing force that prevented their anxieties from turning into a panic. Every time they looked at him, they were reminded that he was the world's light and that no night could ever defeat them where he went. Maybe they thought about Lazarus himself during those hours. They imagined his warm greeting as they arrived. At Bethany's gates, his smile and the way his laughter had filled rooms. They pictured Martha's agitated pacing, Mary's tears, and the burden of grief bearing down on the home. Even as their eyes grew tired and their legs hurt, the thought of their sorrow kept them moving forward. This journey was not only for Lazarus, but also for the family who had always shown love without reservation. To love is to bear the burden of another. Mile by mile, step by step, the gap narrowed. The end of the road was unknown to the disciples. They were unable to foresee the wonder that would transpire in Bethany or how this journey would permanently change their perspective on life and death. All they knew was that they were walking in the footsteps of the one whose serene presence stilled their quivering hearts and who walked with purpose. There was more to the journey than just travel. Every dusty footprint was a test of bravery, a pilgrimage of trust, and a gradual development of faith. The disciples followed Jesus, but they also walked in the shadow of his will as the road dwindled toward Bethany. Their questions were seen by the landscapes, their prayers were heard by the streams, and their fears were observed by the skies. Nevertheless, the quiet of expectation kept them moving forward, because a story bigger than they could imagine lay beyond the stone walkways and olive groves. the village gradually came into view as the road to Bethany wound through the well-known groves. Its low walls, where vines reached languidly toward the sun, and olive trees shaded the stone houses that clung to the hillsides. Grief hung heavy in the air. Lazarus was gone, and word had already gotten out. Once full of warmth and laughter, the home now throbbed with the muted weight of grief. Family and friends from Jerusalem had gathered inside to console Mary and Martha, their presence a flimsy attempt to ease the pain, their voices a low murmur. However, Martha left those walls when she learned that Jesus was approaching. She ran down the path to meet him as her heart drew her forward and her steps became urgent. The dust rose behind her like shadows of her, restlessness as her sandals brushed the ground, longing, grief, and the questions that had been burning in her heart. These past few days drove every step she took. She had prayed, waited, and watched her brother leave, her hope ebbing away as her pleas were met with silence. And now here he was, the teacher she trusted, the one she loved. But he had not arrived in time. Even as she hurried to him, the pain of that reality weighed heavily on her. She finally saw him standing by the road, with the disciples gathered nearby but in silence. Her chest tightened, her breath caught, and the tears that had threatened to fall finally trickled down her cheeks. Martha's lips quivered as she uttered the words her heart had practiced over and over again. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." The simplicity of her words conveyed the depth of her sorrow. They were not accusations, but rather the admission of a wounded faith that persisted, despite being shattered by grief, as if bearing the weight of her suffering and the serenity of unchanging truth. Jesus' eyes met hers, steady and gentle. His words, "Your brother will rise again," fell between them like a tiny seed full of boundless promise, and he spoke softly, not to chastise but to comfort. But Martha could only understand what made sense because her thoughts were focused on the religious patterns she had learned. As if practicing a doctrine she had long held, she responded swiftly, almost mechanically, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Her heart ached in the present, but her hope was stretched toward the future. She had faith, but it seemed far away, unattainable, and unrelated to her current grief. Jesus didn't abandon her at that point. He pulled the truth in close, bringing it into his presence and out of the realm of impersonal hope. "I am the resurrection and the life," he said in a deepening voice that was both authoritative and compassionate. "If you believe in me, you will live even if you die, and if you believe in me, you will never die. Are you convinced?" Not only were these words consoling, but they also marked a paradigm shift in how death was understood. His words weighed heavily on Martha's heart, which was already grieving. Here was the one who spoke of life as though death had no enduring claim, but she had come with grief, her voice heavy with loss. Even though her heart still hurt and her tears were still burning, something inside of her changed, as if hope were beginning to shine through the void. Her response was straightforward but profound. "Yes, Lord," she said, taking a breath that calmed her shaking. "I think you are the Son of God, the Messiah, who is supposed to arrive on earth." Her admission arose in the darkness like a delicate yet radiant candle. She professed faith in the one in front of her, despite the fact that her brother was in a tomb and that sorrow had engulfed her soul. This marked the start of something bigger than she could have ever dreamed. But it also marked the end of her grief and her questions. The landscape itself appeared to pause in the silence of that moment, as if in submission to the one who had spoken life over death. The olive trees swayed gently. The road led back to Bethany behind her, where Mary stayed inside the house, her heart too heavy to move, and mourners still filled the house. However, a silent encounter that had eternal meaning in its words took place here, outside the village. After hearing what they had just heard, the disciples listened in silence, their hearts aflutter. Even though they also felt sorry for Lazarus, they were now confronted with a reality that would soon be made public, not just through words, but also through power. Martha's tears did not stop, but they did slow down. She felt the weight of her loss as well as the odd, constant serenity of Jesus' presence as she gazed into his eyes. Even though her heart was still broken and her faith was not perfect, his words had met her right where she was. He had responded with life when she had run to him in grief. She seemed to be returning home via the same route that had brought her from her home to this encounter, but with more than just sadness in her heart. She turned, breathing steadily and walking more slowly now. Perhaps another grieving heart would find the same hope in that moment if she went to Mary and whispered that the teacher was present. Even so, Martha was unable to completely comprehend what was going to happen as she made her way back toward Bethany. The one she had just confessed as Messiah was getting ready to enter that place of silence and demonstrate that even the grave must bow before him. But the tomb still contained her brother, and the stone still sealed the darkness. It was more than just a conversation when they met on that dusty road. It served as a link between hopelessness and optimism, between divine promise and human loss. Although Martha had run with grief in her heart, she left with a message that would soon shine through the world with unfathomable clarity. That death was not the last word in Jesus. There was a lot of silence in the Bethany house, but there were also whispers in the corners and Jerusalem friends sitting next to Mary in silent support. The scent of spices wafted through the air, mingling with the dust from the road and the odor of rituals of mourning. With her robe wrapped around her like a shield, Mary sat low to the ground. Unlike her sister, she had not hurried to meet Jesus. Instead, grief had kept her grounded, as if the weight of her sorrow had forced her farther into the ground. Every dim nook and cranny now reverberated with the memory of Lazarus, his laughter, his soft voice, his presence that had pervaded this very house. And she felt as if her chest held nothing but brokenness, despite her longing for comfort. She was awakened by Martha's hushed words and hurried footsteps. In a whisper that only Mary could hear, Martha leaned in and said, "The teacher is here and is asking for you." Her words shone like a beacon into the depths of Mary's sorrow. Jesus had called her name even in the midst of the thick pain of loss and the silence of mourning. She got up fast, her body shaking, her eyes still wet. Those who sat close to her noticed her movement and, thinking she was going to the tomb to cry there, got up and followed, not wanting to leave her to mourn alone. She could see the road in front of her, each step bringing pain and longing. Mary lost her composure when she finally saw him. The delicate poise she had attempted to keep was shattered by the sight of Jesus, gentle, steady, and so close. She accelerated until she came to him, and then she collapsed at his feet. Her sobs rose like waves from the depths of her grief as her body folded into the dust and her hands pressed into the ground. Her voice broke and her tears mixed with the dust at his feet as she blurted out, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Her words were filled with love and agony. There was a sacred stillness in the scene. The disciples were nearby, sorrow obscuring their faces. Mary's unadulterated grief pierced the hearts of those who had followed her out of the house. When Jesus saw her there, he took on her suffering as if it were his own. Her tears were a cry of the human heart, a yearning for presence in the face of unfathomable loss, and they were more than just words of sorrow. Jesus glanced at her, then at the people in the crowd. He witnessed their tears, their grief, and their hearts broken by death. According to Scripture, he was troubled and profoundly moved in spirit. He joined in their sorrow rather than avoiding it. The one in charge of life did not observe indifferently. Rather, he felt the world's brokenness, the pain of loss, and the sting of death pressing into his own heart. Mary's shoulders continued to tremble, but her sobs temporarily stopped. The safest place she knew to vent her grief without embarrassment was at his feet, where she remained low. Then something extraordinary occurred in that tender silence. According to the Gospel, Jesus wept. These two words, which are so little yet so profound, capture the breadth of his compassion. The universe's creator knelt down in the human dust and shed tears. Some in the crowd whispered to one another, "Look how he loved him," because his tears showed his love for everyone who was grieving, not just Lazarus. There was no hurry, no pressure to get over the sadness. Jesus made room for sorrow to exist and for tears to fall freely. Even the act of crying became a sacred language between the heart and God because of his tears, which sanctified human suffering. Mary must have experienced an odd mixture of pain and consolation while she was still at his feet. The fact that Jesus was crying with her added a new weight to her grief, one that did not crush her but instead whispered of love too deep to quantify. Even though her brother was still in a tomb and her loss remained the same, the scene was soft with the rawness of human vulnerability as the mourners watched, their own tears streaming down their faces. As if creation itself were bearing witness, the olive trees swayed softly overhead, their branches catching the afternoon light. Time seemed to stop, and the only sound on the path was that of people crying. Because in this holy moment, God's heart was shown in both shared grief and strength. Mary didn't have to elaborate. Her tears had conveyed what words could not, and Jesus' response was not one of justification or logic, but rather his own tears. That he chose to experience grief before revealing joy despite knowing what was going to happen was the mystery of his compassion. He sat in the agony of death's shadow even though he knew Lazarus would walk again because love carries pain rather than avoiding it. When the silence finally broke, it did so deliberately rather than hurriedly. "Where have you laid him?" Jesus inquired. With low voices, the mourners responded, and they all started to approach the tomb. However, the memory of that moment persisted. Mary's tears at his feet. His tears mixed with hers, presence met with grief. The image of the teacher bending down, the sisters expressing their grief, and the sound of divine compassion breaking. The mourning silence was etched in the hearts of those who witnessed it. The fact that God himself becomes involved in human suffering, that he does not stand far from our suffering, but rather approaches, sits with us in the dust, and weeps with us, was a glimpse into a reality that those who followed him would only fully comprehend later. Something eternal had already been revealed in that sacred pause, but the road to the tomb still lay ahead. One of the most personal insights into Jesus' heart was revealed through Mary's sorrow at his feet. The presence of the one who wept changed that moment's sadness forever. But it was not erased. There were people on the road to Lazarus' tomb. It was lined with Jerusalem visitors, friends, and neighbors who had come to console Mary and Martha during their sorrow. Back then, grieving wasn't something that was kept quiet or concealed. Rather, it was something that was carried and shared. By all, the community came together to sit, cry, and remember when a household lost a loved one. Jesus was therefore confronted by the collective sound of grief as he approached the tomb, a low, agonizing chorus of voices, each bearing the burden of loss. Weeping, a sound that seemed to rise and fall like waves crashing upon the shore of human grief, shook the air. From a place beyond words, women sat on the ground with their clothes gathered around them and their voices raised in laments. Whispering prayers into their hands, some rocked softly, swaying in time with their sorrow. Heads bowed, men stood in silent groups, their silence laden with sorrow and reverence. Even though they didn't fully comprehend, children held on to their mothers' robes because they could feel the seriousness of the situation and how grief hung in the air like smoke. The normally bustling village of Bethany was now quiet and characterized by mourning. This grief was given shape by Jewish tradition. In an obvious indication that their hearts had been ripped by loss, mourners tore the edges of their clothing. Sometimes they would place ashes on the head, the gray dust reminding them that life comes back to earth and speaking of mortality. In addition, there were frequently hired mourners present, whose voices rose in ceremonial laments that blended with the sobs of loved ones. It was a culture that recognized the importance of giving voice and body to the pain inside in order to communicate grief externally. Sorrow was not concealed when we wept together. Rather, it was respected, acknowledged, and shared. Weeping sounded like a song, deeply united but not harmonious. Although each voice was unique, some low and trembling, others sharp with agony, they all blended to create a chorus of human sorrow. They wept not just for Lazarus, but also for all the losses they had experienced and all the farewells that had left them with a heavy heart. Mourning had the power to bring up old grievances and serve as a reminder of unhealed wounds. As a result, the crowd cried not just for Lazarus, but also for themselves, their personal loss stories, and the tenuous thread of life that united them all. The sisters moved in the midst of the lament. Mary was surrounded by women who were following her closely, their hands reaching out as if to steady her, still raw from the tears she shed at Jesus' feet. Despite her internal trembling, Martha remained close by, her presence serving as both a stabilizing force and a mirror of her own suffering. Every bereaved heart in the room was reflected in their sorrow-stricken faces. Their grief was shared, amplified by every voice in that assembly. Even though the community had come to console them, olive trees and stones that silently watched the procession lined the narrow path leading to the tomb. The smell of earth and oil mixed with the dust that rose beneath the sandals of those who walked. As if every step of the journey had significance, the mourners took their time and walked slowly. The tomb was close by, but the path leading there was a hallowed one that was traversed with respect and grief. Jesus walked among them, and those who were close to him looked at his face, seeking insight, seeking something more than their own suffering. They had heard tales of his strength, miracles, and healings. Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind have prevented this man from dying? Some murmured to one another in low, hushed tones. It was more confusion, the human heart juggling the conflict between faith and loss than accusations. When confronted with death's reality, even hope faltered. The customs of mourning continued. Some screamed, "Alas, unfortunately," allowing the sound to reverberate throughout the atmosphere, in order to give the body something to do when the soul felt. Disorganized, some people beat their chests lightly. Despite the gloomy atmosphere, there was an odd tenderness and a feeling that their shared grief was what connected them. Every tear was joined by another, and no one cried in solitude. Kids felt the moment too. With wide eyes and quiet little voices, they observed the adults. When one tugged at a mother's sleeve and whispered, "Why did everyone cry?" the answer would be soft and shaky, "Because we loved him. Because he is no longer with us." Grief thus became not just something endured, but also something passed on, serving as a reminder that love is never free and that loss is a natural part of life. Finally, the tomb appeared, carved into the stone hillside and sealed with a large rock that was rolled into position. As they gathered in front of it, the crowd became motionless, their cries turning into whispered sniffles and sobs. The sound of weeping that had grown tired and the rustle of clothing were the only sounds to break the silence that had previously been filled with wailing. They were forced to face the finality of death by the stark, immovable tomb. Lazarus was lying here. Hope appeared to be blocked off behind stone here. Where love had met its limit, Jesus stood in front of the tomb, his face expressing the people's grief as well as something more profound, something concealed but not absent. Those in his immediate vicinity watched, their hearts still shattered and their tears still fresh. The collective weight of grief covered the scene like a blanket as the mourners held their breath. It was the climax of their grief, the tomb. In front of them, sealed and silent, their hearts quivering with loss. The people grew closer to one another, and their mere presence was consoling. According to their ancestors' custom, they would stay with the bereaved family, share meals, and sit in silence if necessary, because grieving was never supposed to be done alone. The community as a whole stepped into the river of grief that day in Bethany, their tears merging into a single stream that flowed in front of their friend's tomb. Nevertheless, something unsaid lingered in the air even as they were grieving. The presence of Jesus among them created a silent uneasiness, as if mystery and grief were about to collide, even though their voices cried out of loss. However, for the time being, the people were standing in their sorrow, their anguish spilling onto the ground like oil, their mourning being both incredibly holy and incredibly human. All eyes were drawn to Jesus' face as the mourners stood in front of the sealed tomb, their sobs turning into a soft hum. After hearing Mary's anguish and feeling the shaky weight of Martha's sorrowful hope, he stood motionless and stared at the stone that separated his beloved friend from the world. The people who had gathered might have anticipated consoling words, or even a prayer that rose to heaven, but what they saw instead was a scene that went beyond any ceremonial mourning. Jesus himself broke down in tears. The wave of emotion shook his shoulders, which were usually strong during healings and steady during storms. Tears silently trickled down his cheeks and into the dust at his feet as his eyes filled. The Son of God, who opened blind eyes and calmed Seas now stood helplessly in the middle of human suffering, crying alongside those who were crying. The ensuing quiet was profound, not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet that arises when the sacred is revealed. The crowd, which had just moments before erupted in cries, fell silent in wonder at the extent of his compassion. Those who were less certain whispered, "Could not he who healed the blind man have prevented Lazarus from dying?" Others whispered, "See how he loved him." However, even as they asked questions, their gaze lingered on his tears, because it was uncommon to witness a rabbi, teacher, or other authority figure so visibly affected by grief. In a way that words could not, his tears helped to heal the gap between humanity and divinity. His tears did not resemble the ritual wails of hired mourners or the unvarnished cries of a family ripped apart by unexpected loss. It was something more profound, something that carried the grief of divine compassion as well as the pain of human friendship. There was only truth in his tears, no pretense or performance. Love demanded that they fall. They fell because death still had a sting that wounded the human heart, even though it was only a temporary part of his plan. Thus, the people witnessed that his love was not lofty and far away, but rather close and gentle, able to stoop down to share in his friend's suffering. Message beyond words was conveyed by the tears that streamed down his face. They described a God who enters into suffering, feels it, and tastes it rather than just watching it from a throne of glory. They spoke of a God who is moved by our losses rather than unaffected by them, who weeps with us and shares our sorrow rather than dismissing it. His tears demonstrated that deep love requires allowing one's heart to be broken, but grief and compassion are not signs of weakness or frailty. His tears revealed the mystery of divine empathy in a way that was both holy and human. While watching, some in the crowd reflected on their own losses, the mothers, fathers, kids, and friends they had laid to rest. Jesus' tears showed that their sorrow was not unheard. It seemed as if he had heard every cry cried into the night and every tear shed in secret. They witnessed God himself bending down to comfort the hurting heart through his tears. Because grieving is frequently a lonely journey, the one with authority over life itself shared Bethany's sorrow on that particular day. The disciples also stood close by, their faces unsure. They had witnessed their teacher stand with wet cheeks in front of a tomb after witnessing him bravely face opposition, storms, and demons. They were surprised to learn that his tears did not lessen his power, but rather made it even more apparent. The kingdom he described was based on love that was sensitive enough to cry, not on hard hearts. The mystery of a Messiah who was both lion and lamb, strength wrapped in compassion, authority wrapped in love. They may not have fully understood it yet, but they sensed it. Jesus' tears were a reflection of his sorrow for humanity as a whole, not just his grief for a friend. Because death was never supposed to be the last word. Humanity was created for life, for relationship with God, and for happiness free from sorrow. However, the shadow of death had crept in and was hovering over every home, family, and heart. He was grieving not only for one man but also for the entire creation, which was writhing under the weight of mortality as he stood in front of Lazarus's tomb. For Lazarus and everyone who would ever experience the bitterness of death, his tears were both cosmic and personal. Nevertheless, his tears were not ones of hopelessness. They weren't the despairing cries of a helpless person standing in front of a grave. Instead, They were the tears of love, the kind that weeps profoundly while maintaining the assurance of hope. He was aware of what was coming. He was aware that death would soon release its captive, that his friend would rise, and that the stone in front of him would be moved. He still cried, because love does not minimize or hasten pain. Even when it is aware that redemption is imminent, true love fully embraces it. He sobbed because Lazarus had actually passed away, Mary and Martha had actually suffered, and the mourners had actually experienced loss. Even as his power was ready to change their sorrow, his tears honored it. Jesus' tears became more consoling than words for the people in attendance. It was a sign of love and compassion to watch him cry. The divine was among them, his tears mixing with theirs, not far away or out of reach. Because every tear he shed contained a promise that grief is visible, that sorrow matters, and that love is powerful enough to bear it. His tears were not a sign of weakness but of strength, the ability to hold the frail human heart, to honor its suffering, and to guarantee that no tear is ever wasted. Every tear that fell as a testament to his love left its mark on the dust beneath his feet, as though creation itself echoed the sorrow of its creator. The olive trees in the area swayed gently in the wind, their branches rustling like a gentle lament. And even though the crowd was still overcome with grief, they experienced a subtle change, as if hope had touched their hearts despite their sadness. Since the God who rules the seas and raises the dead is also the God who sits next to the mourner, wipes away tears, and is not ashamed to cry, the people of Bethany learned something eternal in that moment. His tears sanctified their own, transforming grief into a shared experience with the limitless loving one rather than a solitary burden. He then stood in front of Lazarus's tomb, his heart open, his eyes sparkling, and his cheeks damp. Even in their confusion, the mourners realized that this was no ordinary man when they saw him, because only the one with the power of eternity could allow his tears to fall upon the dust of a dying world, and only the one with infinite love could weep with such depth. Before arriving at the location of Lazarus's tomb, the path wound gently through the village, past the olive trees whose branches rustled in the wind. It was a straightforward cave carved into the rocky hillside, sealed with a heavy stone rolled firmly across its entrance. It was not a magnificent monument, a location marked with splendor, or carved with elaborate design. Except for the soft rustle of grass and the soft footsteps of people walking by, there was no sound to break the stillness. There was a solemn weight to the air around it, as if the stones themselves recalled the cries of mourning that had lingered there. The tomb communicated in its silence, not with words, but with the profound finality of death. The stone itself represented weight. Those who gazed upon it felt as though their hearts were being pressed against its cold, rough gray surface. It was the outward manifestation of what had occurred, that life had vanished, that breathing had stopped, and that Lazarus's laughter had ceased to fill the air. The silence behind that stone was more profound than the night's stillness. It was the silence of someone who no longer talks, moves, or dreams. Even though the mourners were unable to see him, they were always affected by his absence. The stone was the seal of death, and death had drawn its curtain as if time itself slowed. In reverence, the air felt heavier around the tomb. As they got closer, the villagers' laughter grew softer, their voices grew softer, and their steps faltered. Even kids, who typically ran unhindered in the lanes, gravitated toward their moms because they sensed in their naivete that happiness had been suppressed here. Silent but unwavering, grief appeared to drape the hillside like a veil. In addition to serving as Lazarus's final resting place, the tomb had evolved into a hub for grief in general. There is a silence around death that is unlike any other silence. It is not the quiet of a sleeping village or the soft silence of dawn. Beyond what the ear can perceive, there is a sense of immensity in the silence, reminding the soul of what has been lost and what cannot be recovered. It presses in. The villagers felt this silence descend upon them like a thick shroud as they stood close to the tomb. Others swiftly turned away, unable to stand the weight of it for very long, while others bowed their heads in prayer. But they were all aware of the same reality. Lazarus was gone, and there was nothing they could do to bring him back. The tomb appeared to serve as a teacher, serving as a reminder of one's own mortality to everyone who saw it. Every individual, regardless of age, experienced the echo of their own demise in a secret location within their heart. Every voice would eventually fade, every face would close its eyes, and every hand would rest according to the silence of the sealed stone. Its message was certain and pierced deeply, but it was not cruel, because there is no need to shout in the silence of death. Every soul is roused to contemplation and fear by its silence alone. Since the burial, Mary and Martha had made numerous trips along this path. In addition to housing their brother's body, the tomb served as a conduit for their sorrow. Every time they gazed at the stone, they recalled the warmth of his presence at the table, the sound of his laughter in their house, and the loving way he had spoken to them. It all appeared to have been engulfed by that cave, by the shadows behind the stone. They wanted to reach through it, to talk to him again, but all they got in return was emptiness from the silence. Their hearts were most affected by this silence, which seemed to be louder than any cries. The air inside the tomb was motionless and still, the kind of motionlessness that does not anticipate change. Lazarus's body lay in the silence of the rock, the linens that had been wrapped around him still in place. In that shadowy room, there were no voices, no prayers, no songs of consolation, just the patient, uncompromising presence of death. The world was held back by the stone outside, which made sure that life and death were kept apart. Human helplessness was exposed in that separation. No amount of begging or love could get past that line. Nevertheless, there was an odd sort of reverence despite the weight of his silence. People recalled the depth of life in the tomb's silence. They recalled the wonder of laughter, the beauty of breath, and the value of time spent together. The quiet of death increased the value of life. In hindsight, every word and every smile seemed like a gift that was too easily taken for granted. Without using words, the tomb left a lasting impression on everyone who saw it. To love is to hold something immeasurable in value, and to live is to be frail. Grief ties the heart to the place where loss resides, which is why the villagers stayed close to the tomb rather than hoping for change. They kept going back as if their presence could pay tribute to Lazarus's memory. A few sat silently on the ground close by, making patterns in the dust. Others placed tiny flower and herb sprigs against the stone as a delicate gift to a friend who was no longer able to accept them. In the face of what seemed unchangeable, these actions allowed the mourners to show their love. Even though they were unable to break the silence, The tomb's silence permeated the mourners' souls as well as their surroundings. It echoed in the silences between their words and slept in the corners of their rooms as they made their way home. They were reminded of what they had lost by the deathly silence that seemed to reverberate throughout the village at night as it grew quieter. There was a silence that was unavoidable and that never slept. It was steady, patient, and uncompromising, and it left its mark on their hearts through its perseverance. The sealed tomb was a sobering sight, even for the disciples who had walked with Jesus and witnessed unimaginable miracles. Even though they had heard him talk about life, resurrection, and God's ability to heal, the stone seemed to convey a different message. It was a tale of conclusions, of finality, of a world where death took its own without opposition. They also felt the pressure of silence, since they did not yet know what was going to happen. They were reminded by the tomb that even faith must occasionally traverse valleys where solutions are concealed. Thus, the tomb remained silent and motionless, containing the grief of everyone who loved Lazarus as well as his memory. Although it was silent, it wasn't void. It was full of unresolved questions, longing, and the silent prayers of friends, neighbors, and sisters. In addition to serving as a physical barrier, the stone in front of its entrance represented the gap between the mystery of eternity and human hearts. It maintained a profound silence, but that silence also set the stage for something bigger than anyone could have yet imagined. But for the time being, the tomb stayed the same, sealed, motionless, and burdened by the presence of death. Everyone who came near it was moved by its ethereal silence, which served as a reminder of their own frailty and desire. It was an indestructible silence that seemed to hold on forever. The people waited in that silence, but they had no idea what they were waiting for. All they knew was that the weight of their hearts was as heavy as the stone itself. As they stood in front of the tomb, the silence was thick with stillness. Like a final decree, the round, immovable stone rested against the entrance, announcing that death had completed its task and sealed its triumph. Since the stone was both physical and symbolic in their hearts, the mourners who had gathered could not fathom it being moved. It stood between hope and despair, between life and death, between what was gone and what would never be back. Jesus' command, "Take away the stone," shattered that silence like a soft but potent echo. His words were straightforward, but they carried a weight that made people uneasy. The silence shuddered in that instant, a mixture of wonder and fear. Hesitancy suddenly pervaded the atmosphere. "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for it has been 4 days," said Martha, her face etched with sorrow, her voice trembling as she spoke, not in defiance but with the honesty of sorrow, the realism of one who had witnessed her brother's burial. She was aware of what the stone shielded them from. She was aware of what was behind it. As if they would disturb what death had claimed, the idea of opening the tomb seemed intolerable, almost invasive. Her protest was enshrouded in the boundaries of human comprehension and love for her brother. Uncertain looks were exchanged as the crowd shifted uneasily. Some folded their arms and stared at Jesus, trying to make sense of what he was saying, while others whispered softly. This was different from the times they had witnessed him heal the sick and restore sight to the blind. Lazarus was dead, but healing was for the living. They were reminded of that fact by the stone. Is it possible to roll it away? would it not more starkly expose the agonizing truth of death? Their hearts vacillated between fear and obedience as they prepared to open the tomb, which meant facing despair had dash on dot in spite of their uncertainties. Jesus stood composedly, his presence like a constant flame. "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" He reminded Martha, his eyes unwavering, his voice gentle yet authoritative. It was a silent call to raise her eyes above the stone and into the invisible world of divine possibility rather than a rebuke. Even though his words didn't make her heart any less sad, they gave her a glimmer of hope that dared to believe in something bigger than grief. The order to move the stone was still in effect. The men closest to the tomb moved forward slowly, their faces white with doubt, their steps tentative. The stone felt rough under their palms as they laid their hands on its cold surface. They paused for a moment, glancing back at Jesus, Mary, and Martha. As if the air itself held its breath with them, their breaths became shallow. Then they pushed together. At first, the stone resisted, moaning against the ground as though it was hesitant to let go. With a deep grinding sound, the stone started to shift as muscles strained and feet pressed into the ground. The silence that had surrounded the tomb was broken by the sound of the stone moving across the hillside. It stirred the hearts of those present with a low rumble that was not one of violence but one of release. As the entrance gradually became visible, some people covered their mouths while others took a step back and gaped. With the weight of loss and remembrance, dust rose into the air. The stone rolled aside, revealing a deep, shadowed cave with an eerie silence that was made more eerie by the removal of the barrier. With their fingers intertwined in a grip that conveyed both fear and desire, Mary's hand gripped Martha's. Although their eyes were unable to reach the depths of the tomb, they looked into the opening. It was a gateway to uncertainty and mystery. The audience leaned forward as well, divided between excitement and fear. They anticipated smelling the foul stench of decay, a sobering reminder of death's power. However, there was only silence in the still air, as if creation itself was anticipating what would happen next. Rolling the stone away was more than just a physical exercise. It was a sign of submission, the submission of human comprehension to divine. Authority was conveyed by every creak of rock against earth and the labored breathing of the pushing men. It was a willingness to let go of certainty and open their grief to the possibility of something bigger. The mourners were exposed to both hope and disappointment because the open tomb was a risky act of faith. The soil of their hearts, however, was prepared for something wonderful in that vulnerability. Jesus stood at the doorway, staring into the dark shadows outside. Even though they were not yet able to see what he saw, his composure gave them comfort, because his silence was so authoritative and promising at that precise moment. It spoke louder than words. Once a sign of hopelessness, the open tomb was now a platform for the revelation of God's glory. Although the crowd was still in the dark, something they couldn't identify was making their hearts race. Time seemed to slow down, like the pause before a storm, even as they stood there with the stone rolled aside. The villagers moved and spoke in hushed, nervous whispers. Children felt the odd tension in the air and clung to their mother's clothing, while some hung back, unwilling to approach the cave's dark mouth. Others moved closer to improve their vision. All eyes were on Jesus, anticipating, observing, and speculating about his next move. The tension vibrated between hope and fear like a taut thread. The sisters' hearts were heavy with the weight of this moment, and they were still crying. The stone had been more than just a rock to them. It had been the symbol of their brother's demise and the seal of their loss. The tomb was now open in front of them, and it was gone. Now there was a shaky expectation mixed with the grief that had seemed inevitable. Even though they had no idea what it meant yet, they had the impression that something extraordinary was about to happen that would alter their perspective on life and death forever. A hush of expectation replaced the silence as the stone lay rolled away. The way was open, the barrier was gone, and the tomb no longer concealed what was inside. With their hearts divided between hope for life and fear of death, the mourners stood united in their mutual uncertainty. The open tomb became the scene of an unimaginable revelation, and the moment lingered, frozen in time. After the stone was rolled away, the silence seemed to be even more profound, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. Every eye was drawn to the tomb's open mouth, which gaped like a sinister mystery, but none dared to venture too far inside. Hearts thumping with a mix of fear and anticipation, the mourners stood motionless, quiet and apprehensive. Something invisible weighed heavily on the air, pressing down on them with a gentle yet firm pressure. Nobody made a move. Nobody said anything. Everyone waited. Then Jesus raised his eyes to heaven in that tense silence. Intimacy softened his gaze, not toward the crowd, but toward the Father. His lips parted in prayer, and his voice rose not in despair, but with serene assurance, the words coursing through their sorrow like a soft stream. He expressed gratitude to the Father for always hearing him. He prayed for those standing there to believe, not for himself. It was a prayer of unity, of assurance, and a reminder that divine will, not human effort, was behind what was about to occur. As the words sunk into the listeners' hearts, calming their anxieties and lifting their thoughts, the silence grew deeper. Leaning in, they tried to hear every word. While some closed their eyes with trembling tears on their lashes, others clasped their hands. The prayer had no bitterness or despair, unlike the cries of mourners to which they had become accustomed in recent days. Instead, it was full of confidence and reverence, as if Jesus already knew the miracle was happening. Heaven and earth appeared to touch during that prayer, and the line separating life and death shook after the prayer. There was a sharper, more electric silence that resembled the stillness before thunder roared across the sky. Hearts pounding. The crowd shifted nervously. Everybody looked at Jesus, who was now facing the shadowy tomb entrance. He moved in closer, his powerful, steady body outlined against the darkness. There was no sign of doubt on his face. He exuded authority in every line of his posture, but it was tinged with such deep compassion that it calmed the quivering hearts around him. Then came the words, unflinching, unambiguous, and commanding, "Come forth, Lazarus." Jesus' voice echoed against the cave's stone walls and reverberated into the void of darkness. It was a firm and authoritative declaration that reverberated through the still air like a trumpet call, not a plea or a whisper. The sound seemed to pierce the silence of death itself, as if it reached into invisible realms. The words echoed and lingered, sending chills down the spines of those who heard them. Time stopped. There was only the echo fading into silence for a heartbeat. With their eyes fixed on the shadowy aperture, the mourners held their breath, some gripping each, others' arms. The kids pressed up against their moms, wide-eyed. Unable to resist the pull of that voice, some ventured closer. Others hung back, torn between shaky hope and incredulity. There seemed to be nothing but silence inside the tomb. Then there was movement, very slight, almost imperceptible. The rustle of cloth against stone, the shuffling sound. The crowd, straining to see into the darkness, let out gasps. It was unclear at first, like a dream emerging in the nighttime mists, but it became more apparent. A figure stirred from the tomb's depths. Eyes widened, lips parted in shock, and the tension broke open into awe. Bound in burial garments, Lazarus appeared. It was nearly impossible to believe the first glimpse. His face was hidden, his body was tightly wrapped in linen, and he walked slowly and unsteadily, as if he had just woken up from a deep sleep. He acted in response to the command that had summoned him, not solely on his own initiative. Once more, the audience gasped, with some covering their mouths and others yelling in shock. Tears streamed down the faces of those who had only moments before accepted their fate. The sight of their brother alive left Martha and Mary speechless. Shock, joy, relief, and love all rushed over them at once, causing their hands to shake and their hearts to pound with feelings they couldn't control. Their sobs of wonder replaced their cries of grief, and their mourning garments felt suddenly out of place in the face of this miracle. Instinctively, they reached forward, as though they were worried he might disappear. If they didn't hold him tight, the people's incredulity turned to awe as they pressed closer. Some were so overcome by what they saw that they collapsed to their knees. Others muttered prayers to themselves, unable to understand, but also unable to ignore what they were seeing. They were witnesses to the voice of life breaking the silence of death. However, Lazarus remained restrained, the grave garments encircling him, preventing him from moving. Despite being covered, his face turned to face the person who had called him and the light. Jesus then said, "Unbind him and let him go," with the same composed authority. The words were gentle and liberating, as though to remind them that resurrection meant more than just coming back to life. It meant being freed from all that was bound. The men closest hurried forward and started to unwrap the linen strips, their hands shaking. Lazarus stood free, breathing, alive, his face regaining its color as the grave garments came off one by one. Every breath he took caused his chest to rise and fall in a rhythm that filled the air with wonder. The crowd's grief turned into an uncontrollable joy as they burst into cries of awe and praise. The moment was permanently etched in the hearts of those who witnessed it. Jesus' command had transcended death's finality and reached a place that was beyond the reach of human strength. Lazarus stood as a living example of divine authority after his powerful yet kind voice had brought life back from the dead. Once a place of grief, the tomb was now a portal to wonder. Hope was now fulfilled, and the stone that had sealed despair was witness to it. And the promise that the same power still speaks into darkness and calls life where all seems lost would reverberate through generations, echoing the voice that had raised one man from the dead. The people lingered in the midst of this miracle, stunned and overwhelmed. Their eyes were fixed on the friend they had mourned but now embraced. Their laughter mixed with tears of joy, and their whispers of surprise filled the air. Lazarus was still alive. They had rewritten their grief, and it had all happened through a voice that broke the stillness and evoked life. It was clear, commanding, and full of love. The faint sound of movement, at first fragile and unreal, like a stirring dream, emerged from the tomb's darkness. The audience leaned forward, gasping for air, their hearts racing with a mix of shock and desire. The shuffling of feet against stone broke the stillness, and the sound spread outward, getting louder until it filled the still air. Then a figure, clad from head to foot in strips of linen, emerged at the entrance of the tomb. Even with his face still restrained and his arms and legs restrained in the rigid clothing of death, he made a tentative but unavoidable movement. The crowd's gasp rose like one trembling cry as Lazarus entered the daylight. Whispers spread throughout the group, hands went to mouths, and eyes grew wide. A few stumbled back, taken aback by the oddity of what they witnessed. Others rushed forward, seemingly pulled by an unseen force, while elders leaned heavily on their staffs, unable to take their eyes off the incredible sight. Mothers clutched their children. Mary's breath caught in her chest as tears came again, but they weren't tears of sorrow. Martha's lips trembled as if she wanted to call his name, but couldn't find the right words, and her hand shot to her heart. Before them stood the brother they had buried, the one they had lamented for 4 long days. The picture was both amazing and terrifying. The smell of death seemed to cling to the air, and the burial cloths clung to Lazarus like shadows of his time in the grave. Every step he took, however, had life because Jesus' voice had given him new life. As he moved, the sun shone on the wrappings, its rays catching on the folds of linen, as if the miracle had been witnessed even by the grave clothes. Lazarus stood in the threshold, evidence that the boundary had been crossed, but the moment felt as though it was suspended between 2 worlds, the realm of the living and the realm of the dead. Some were so overcome by the power in front of them that they went to their knees. Others, their voices quivering with fear and joy, lifted their hands to the heavens in adoration. The younger ones were so excited that they were yelling in awe and gesturing to the risen man. Shouts evolved into exclamations, murmurs into shouts, and soon the air was filled with a blend of reverent prayers and shocked cries. Everybody's eyes were on Lazarus, and their hearts were racing because they couldn't believe what they were seeing. But there was a silent tenderness underneath the awe. His sisters snapped out of their silence as Lazarus shuffled forward, his linen dragging softly against the floor. Mary dropped to her knees and knelt down, her hands shaking as she reached out to him. Stable now, Martha pushed forward too, her steps accelerating until she was in front of him. She was afraid that if she grasped the delicate miracle too soon, it might disappear, so she dared not touch him yet. Nevertheless, her lips whispered prayers of thanks in between sobs, and her eyes glowed with unfathomable gratitude. The crowd dispersed, their eyes darting between the man who had escaped death's clutches and Jesus, realizing that no regular man could wield such power. Some people gazed at Jesus in wonder. They referred to him as the Messiah, the Son of God, and the one with authority even over death, in whispers that reverberated through the atmosphere. Others just sobbed because they couldn't articulate the range of feelings churning inside of them. They had arrived to comfort 2 distraught sisters, but instead they had seen the impossibility. Jesus stood composedly, displaying authority and compassion at the same time. He turned to those nearby after glancing at Lazarus, who was restrained and unsteady. "Unbind him and let him go." He said in a voice that was both merciful and instructive. The words shook the crowd like a second miracle. Not only had he raised Lazarus from the dead, but he had now commanded his release from the remains of death. A number of men hurried forward, carefully untangling the strips of linen with shaking hands. More of the man underneath was exposed as each layer was removed. His eyes were blinking in the daylight, his skin was warm, and his chest rose and fell with breath. Lazarus took a deep breath as the cloth was taken away from his face, as if he were tasting life for the first time. Once dimmed by death, his eyes glowed brightly as he searched until he saw his sisters' faces. With a cry that was half sob and half laughter, Mary flung herself at him. Martha also clung to him, her arms encircling her brother as if she would never release him. Together, the three wept, their embrace a living testament to love restored. Their cries a mingling of sorrow transformed to joy. The crowd was barely able to control itself. Unexpected laughter erupted, voices rose in adoration of God, and tears fell freely. While some shouted out loud, others clapped their hands together, and still others just stood in stunned silence, their hearts shattered by what they saw. The once solemn assembly of mourners had transformed into a living celebration of divine power. A chorus of joy as they tugged at their sleeves and whispered excitedly. The children, who had previously looked curiously behind their mothers, now pointed at Lazarus with wide-eyed wonder. Elders, their wrinkled faces moist with tears, shook their heads in wonder, believing they had seen everything life had to offer. Even those who had questioned, who had muttered their doubts as the stone was rolled away, were unable to ignore what they saw. Their doubts vanished into silence as the indisputable fact of life in front of them engulfed their inquiries. Lazarus continued to stand, his breathing steady, his body whole, his very being a declaration that death's grip was not final. His sisters clung to him, their voices rising in gratitude to the Lord for restoring their brother, their joy shining. Their hearts grew with unfathomable gratitude, and those around them were compelled to join in. It was revealed that life itself submitted to Jesus' voice, and the miracle was not just for one family, but for everyone who saw it. That's when Bethany became a place of wonder forever. As though participating in the festivities, the olive trees that bordered the pathways appeared to sway more subtly, silently guarding the scene that would be remembered for generations were the hills that surrounded the village. The scent of hope seemed to permeate the air, which had previously been heavy with the weight of grief. The crowd gradually started to comprehend the magnitude of what they had witnessed as the sun's golden rays illuminated the village. Even though a loved one's return was a miracle in and of itself, this was more than that. It was an indication of something bigger, that the one who had summoned Lazarus held the key to life. Even death's finality could not defeat him. It was a whisper of a promise yet to come. As a result, the people wept and celebrated, their lives forever altered, while Lazarus stood alive among them, embraced by his sisters and released from his grave clothes. With every step the deceased man took, his faith grew stronger, his hope was reignited, and his love was revealed in the most amazing way. Mary's tears of happiness poured out like an uncontrollable song as she held on to her brother as if her arms would never be able to let him go. The ache of mourning that had burdened her spirit was suddenly lifted, and every tremor in her body spoke of the days and nights she had spent in grief. Martha pressed her face against Lazarus' shoulder, trembling but steady, her heart thumping with an indescribable sense of gratitude. Together, the three of them stood, united by a love that had endured the shadow of death and come back stronger, more profound and more enduring. Tears of sorrow turned into tears of relief, and tears of anguish into tears of awe. The crowd hovered around them, unable to take their eyes off the splendor of what they saw. It felt as if the entire world was joining them in celebrating. The scent of earth and leaves, along with the still faint scent of the burial spices clinging to Lazarus' linen strips, blended with the gentle rustle of olive branches in the wind. Youngsters began to laugh, timidly at first, then with great delight. They hurried around the throng, pointing to Lazarus, whispering in wonder, and pulling on their mother's robes. They reminded everyone that miracles were not just for the wise, but also for the weakest hearts, and their purity and unadulterated joy encapsulated the essence of the moment. Standing with shaky hands, some of the men who had assisted in unwrapping Lazarus's burial garments continued to rub their palms against the linen they had taken off. They gazed at him as though they were scared to blink for fear of losing the vision. Their faces marked with the weight of what they had witnessed, their voices trailed off as they muttered prayers of gratitude. They knew deep down that the God of Israel had approached and that the prophecies were coming to pass in ways they could never have predicted. Mary drew back just enough to meet Lazarus's face. Her eyes, which had swelled from crying for days, now glowed with a light that was a mixture of amazement and incredulity. Her hand trembled as she lightly touched his cheek, as if she were afraid that if she pressed too hard, he might disappear. Her voice broke under the weight of awe and love as she whispered, "Brother." Lazarus grinned a little, his eyes clear and steady, his lines of fatigue still visible. That grin was sufficient to allay her fears and reassure her that he was actually present. Martha, always pragmatic but profoundly touched, used the back of her hand to wipe tears from her eyes. Her heart was overflowing as she gazed at Jesus. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died," she had said in grief, but now it felt far away, engulfed in a bigger reality. She now understood that his timing had been divinely determined rather than delayed. After being put to the test in a fire, her faith now blazed with a brightness she had never experienced before. All she could do was bow her head in thanksgiving, her lips quivering as she muttered her thanks to the one who had made the impossible possible. Their surroundings started to hum with life, and awe spread from person to person. While some dropped to their knees in awe, others held their hands up to the sky. The sound of rejoicing now filled the village that had been enveloped in mourning. Only moments before, families clung together, their faces moist with tears of wonder, and neighbors embraced one another. Every heart seemed to beat in unison, enthralled by the proximity of divine power and enmeshed in the song of life that had been sung over death. In the middle of the celebration, Jesus stood silently, his presence steady and serene. His eyes were fixed on the reunited siblings, and he had a gentle, almost paternal expression. He hadn't yelled for attention or asked for praise for what he had accomplished. His heart was with the broken and the mourning, and now it was with the restored. The people were aware that this miracle had come from him, from his words, and from his love, even though he remained silent. They were in awe of both Lazarus and the one who had summoned him from the dead. As the burial garments fell away entirely, Lazarus' steps became more confident. He took a deep breath and felt the sun's warmth on his face as he tasted life's air once more. His sisters' voices sounded like the most exquisite music, and the feel of the wind against his skin was like the touch of a long-lost friend. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes and reveled in the small pleasures of life. Even this act was miraculous to those who witnessed it, evidence that he was alive, whole, and restored. A soft silence returned as the crowd pressed in closer, their delight blending with wonder. They wanted to celebrate, but they also wanted to preserve the moment's sanctity and avoid letting it fade too soon into chatter and noise. Knowing they had seen something that would be remembered for generations, they had seen some scenes. They gazed at each other with bright smiles and unrestrained tears. This was an experience that would always be a part of their lives, not just a tale to tell. Through her tears, Mary eventually found her voice. With her hands clasped around his, she whispered, "You returned to us. We believed we had lost you forever." Lazarus nodded slightly, his eyes sparkling with emotion, but he said little, his voice still trapped in the depths of what had transpired. The darkness from which he had been resurrected was more familiar to him than anyone else. His very breath served as evidence that death had complied with Jesus' command. There was a noticeable sense of relief among the sisters. Their souls were exhausted from the long days of waiting, helplessness, and witnessing their brother's deterioration before burying him in the tomb. But now that weight was gone, and a peace that was beyond their comprehension blossomed in its stead. Their once depressing hearts were now bursting with joy and pounding with new vitality. They held on to their brother out of appreciation for the gift of his life being restored rather than out of fear of losing him again. Laughter rose around them, soft at first, almost tentative, then fuller, more unrestrained, like the sound of fresh water tumbling over rocks. It was the laughter of those whose mourning had become dancing, of those who had witnessed the impossibility. Together with the laughter, the voices of praise created a melody that reverberated throughout the village. It was not just the sound of joy. It was the sound of hope, of renewed faith, of hearts lifted by the knowledge that God was closer than they had ever dared to think. The scene appeared to be illuminated by a sacred light as the sun sank lower in the sky, illuminating the clouds with rose and gold hues. The people wished the moment would never end because it dragged on like a soft dream. Unwilling to part, they lingered together, relishing the wonder of what their eyes had witnessed. Every breath their brother took, and every smile he made, was an immeasurable treasure to Mary and Martha. The crowd saw every moment of this miracle as a window into God's heart thought, so they stood together in wonder and delight. Sisters holding their brother, neighbors celebrating with neighbors, and all hearts turned to the one whose love had reached into the tomb and evoked life. Every breath was full of wonder, the air was heavy with thankfulness, and every soul was at peace knowing that light had broken through the darkness of death and hope had overcome despair. With their sandals gently pressed against the ground, the disciples strolled in silent contemplation, their every step a rhythm filled with queries and introspection. They were unable to quickly forget the miracle they had just witnessed because it had altered their perception of everything they had previously believed to be true about life and death. They had witnessed Jesus work miracles before. He had healed the leper, healed the blind, healed the lame, and calmed the storm with a single word. This was different, though. Even the most devoted of them shuddered in wonder at the thought of calling a man back from the dead, calling him out of the tombs. Silence after 4 days. It was more than just a healing miracle. It was enlightenment, a window into secrets that their hearts yearned to understand but their brains found difficult to process. Some of them looked at each other as they walked away from the tomb, their eyes wide with astonishment, as if they were silently questioning whether what they had witnessed was real. The youngest, John, carried the scene like a flame in his heart. He had frequently leaned against Jesus' chest and felt his teacher's steady heartbeat, but now he understood that Christ's heartbeat was more than just human. He possessed a strength that could bend the very limits of existence, a power that went beyond time itself. John recalled what Jesus had said just a short while ago, "I am the resurrection and the life." Those words had sounded enigmatic, almost poetic, but now they throbbed with truth, alive and unquestionable. Peter, who was usually quick to speak and bold, was unusually silent. It had always been him who hurried forward, made pledges of allegiance, and attempted to demonstrate his power. But he had felt small and uneasy as he stood in front of that tomb and heard Jesus' voice calling into the darkness. He reflected on the shadow death had always cast over humanity and his own fear of dying. But at that precise moment, he witnessed death tremble and submit to Jesus' command. Peter's faith grew through reverent silence rather than loud words. Since death had been demonstrated to be helpless in the presence of the Son of God, he came to understand following Jesus was about more than just learning to live differently. It was about learning to not fear death itself. The image of Lazarus staggering out of the tomb, still wrapped in grave clothes, was too much for Thomas, who frequently struggled with doubt and needed evidence to put his heart to rest. The image pressed against his doubts, burning inside him. He had always yearned for something substantial, something to ground his inquisitive nature. And here it was. A man who had been dead was now alive, not in a metaphor or a theory, but in his own flesh and bones. He felt the trembling of restored life beneath his fingers as his hands reached out to steady Lazarus. Thomas knew that this encounter had etched truth into him that he could not deny, no matter how much his heart might struggle in the future. Even though he still carried the burden of his cautious mind. That touch spoke louder than any argument. Once, surrounded by numbers and wealth, Matthew considered the significance in his own way. He reflected on all the people who sought wealth in order to protect themselves from death's inevitable course and attempted to erect fortresses of safety. However, what he witnessed today demonstrated that the gift of life that Jesus provided was greater than any amount of money. Death had complied with a straightforward order, and no man could buy his way out of it. Matthew's heart was released from the allure of material security at that precise moment. He could plainly see that the kingdom Jesus described was based on the everlasting promise of life, which even death could not take away, rather than on money or contracts done in hushed tones. James and Andrew recalled their days as fishermen who threw nets into the sea, believing that life would be nothing more than labor and tides. Now they found themselves standing before eternity, their lives engulfed in something much bigger. The vastness and depth of the sea came to mind, and how even its waves could not match the mystery they had just witnessed. Their hearts were full of wonder, but their words were awkward and their voices faltered as they expressed their awe. They had the impression that they were men who had been invited to see not just miracles, but also the inner workings of God. Each of the disciples shared his thoughts as they gathered that night and conversed in low voices. They were in awe of Jesus' patience in waiting to visit Bethany and his ability to support them during their times of grief and uncertainty. In retrospect, they started to understand why, but it still baffled them. Instead of neglect, the delay had been a prelude, a means for them to better understand the power that would be unveiled. They would have celebrated if Lazarus had been cured before he died, but it would have been a cliched celebration. They realized that Jesus' teachings went beyond human expectations, time, and reason after witnessing life return where death had taken its hold. They also thought about how Jesus was tender and how he had cried with Mary and the mourners. That picture stuck in their minds as much as the order that summoned Lazarus. Seeing his tears was a reminder that his power was love, not icy authority. Love so profound that it shared human suffering while possessing the solution. The disciples understood that their teacher's heart was like this. He entered into, carried, and then transformed sorrow rather than standing apart from it. His power was close rather than far away, encased in both majesty and compassion. They stared at the stars as the night grew darker, their hearts racing with ideas. Some pondered the implications of this for their path and the future. What could oppose Jesus' mission if death could be reversed? They were aware that great power frequently sparked strong opposition, so along with that awe came a subdued uneasiness. The disciples pondered how such a miracle would spread, igniting hearts toward resistance or faith, as the rumors they had heard from some of the religious leaders already suggested uneasiness. One fact, however, became clear to them as they lay together in the silence of the evening. Life and death were not what they had once thought them to be. Like all people, they had lived their entire lives in fear of dying. But now they had witnessed firsthand that death was not final. Jesus could call forth life from the grave rather than it being the end. They did not fully comprehend the courage that would eventually carry them through hardships, persecution, and their own near-death experiences, but that realization sowed the seed of courage in them, though each disciple carried the reflection. In a unique way, they all shared a sense of awe that bonded them to their teacher and to each other. Mary and Martha, as well as the assembled crowd, were the ones for whom Lazarus was raised. It was a lesson etched in their souls, teaching them that faith was trust based on the one who possessed life itself, not naive hope. Even though their bodies grew tired, their spirits remained alert and alive with the knowledge that they had witnessed the glory of God revealed in their midst as they slowly drifted into rest. In the days that followed Lazarus's resurrection, whispers started to move through Jerusalem's streets and into the temple courts like invisible currents. Both those who witnessed the miracle firsthand and those who had only heard the startling news had contributed to its rapid spread. After 4 days in the grave, a man was now walking among the living again. Awe, trembling voices, and the quiet reverence that is reserved for sacred mysteries were all used to tell the story. It inspired faith in hearts that yearned for deliverance and gave many people hope. However, it caused discomfort for others, particularly those in positions of authority within the religious order, posing a threat to the delicate equilibrium they attempted to preserve. The leaders' hearts constricted as they listened to the stories, not with delight, They saw Lazarus' resurrection as a sign of disruption rather than just a miracle to be marveled at. They considered the throngs of people who had already gathered around Jesus wherever he went, captivated by his deeds and clinging to his words. With this act, the numbers would increase, the enthusiasm would rise, and it would be more difficult to control the wave of belief. When the people discovered a new voice to follow, power slipped through fingers like sand. Furthermore, Jesus' voice was not like any other. Unlike the teachers of the law, he spoke authoritatively and had an impact on people's lives that no ritual or decree could match. Conversations became tense in the dimly lit rooms where the elders gathered. Instead of speaking in the boisterous tones of public debate, they used measured words, low murmurs, and glances. They were afraid for the country as a whole, not just for their own power. Some whispered, "If he keeps doing this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will arrive. They will destroy our country and our place." They had to live with a precarious equilibrium, with foreign control weighing heavily on all of their choices. Jesus' rising popularity seemed to them like a spark too near dry straw, a threat that might spark rebellion, unrest, or more severe control from their occupiers, fear of losing control, fear of being overshadowed, fear of change they could not influence, was the root cause of the whispers of resistance, not rational rejection. These leaders were identified as guardians of faith because they had studied the law, recited the prayers, and carried out the rituals. However, they did not bow down in adoration when life itself appeared in front of them, summoning a deceased man back to life. Rather, they flinched as his strength upset the meticulous order they had established. They resisted rather than gave in, as if the light of his presence had exposed fissures in their own foundations. During quieter times, some of them might have secretly questioned whether what they had heard was actually God's doing. However, fear and doubt encircled those ideas like shackles. It would be necessary to let go of pride, relinquish control of authority, and venture into uncharted territory in order to acknowledge that Jesus possessed heavenly authority. That price was too much for many. Thus, the murmurs became determined. Something needs to be done. In the meantime, the ordinary people spoke in awe, their voices resonating through homes and marketplaces, their talis brimming with hope and warmth. They found strength and tenderness in that moment as they recalled Jesus' tears and how he had shed them before calling Lazarus forth. But even as happiness grew, the leaders' shadows grew longer. In the face of truth, their fear did not go away. Rather, it grew stronger, like shadows accumulating in dark corners. The disciples also felt it, albeit more subtly. They saw the alert eyes in the crowds and heard the murmurs on the road. Although they rejoiced over what had been done for Lazarus, there was a faint weight on their shoulders. Tension seemed to be carried by the air itself, a quiet but constant hum of resistance that foreshadowed impending storms. The council chamber in the Sanhedrin turned into a heated discussion forum. Cloaked figures leaned forward with clenched hands and hushed but urgent voices. Some claimed that Jesus needed to be silenced and that his influence needed to be curbed before it got out of hand. Others were hesitant, unsure, and scared to stand up for him but unwilling to publicly disagree. However, fear ultimately brought them closer together than faith could have. They turned against him because of the unavoidable miracle. Outside their walls, the world was still in awe. Now alive, Lazarus himself stood as a silent witness. Every breath he took and every step he took served as a reminder of Jesus' authority. As he pointed and recounted the story, the crowds were filled with awe and their hearts were stirred. Walking among them, this living proof was like a beacon they couldn't put out. The leaders were aware of it, and each day they became more anxious. The whispers were steady enough to reverberate in the darkness, but not loud enough to break the stillness of the night. From one leader to another, they spread like vines creeping across walls until what started out as whispered discomfort turned into a silent decision. The statement, "This man must be opposed," was carried forward in silence rather than being yelled or declared. However, despite their resistance, there was an odd tenderness because they did not publicly express their fear. They covered it up with language of responsibility, caution, and concern for the country. The shaky reality, however, was that they were terrified of him. They were afraid because his goodness exposed their weakness, not because he had done anything wrong. They were afraid because his love attracted those in positions of authority, more powerful than any decree, not because he threatened them with violence. With its typical calm and stars strewn across the sky, night descended upon the city. However, beneath that serene sky, invisible currents moved. Some people's hearts widened as they recalled Lazarus emerging from the tomb. Others' hearts clenched, preparing for the shift they dreaded. And in the voids between, murmurs persisted, faint and far away, bearing the burden of opposition that would soon become more audible. Forming the way forward dot after the miracle, Bethany changed into a place that had never been like it before. With its olive groves swaying in the breeze, the murmurs of neighbors greeting one another, and the soft hum of simple life, the little village, tucked away among the slopes of the Mount of Olives, had long been recognized for its peaceful rhythm. Now, however, a constant flow of footsteps followed its routes. People who had never before dared to venture into Bethany now arrived with hushed voices and inquisitive eyes, as if they were approaching holy territory. They came to see the man who had emerged from his own tomb, the man whose name was a source of wonder in every language, Lazarus of Bethany, rather than just Jesus, who had left and gone on to do his work elsewhere. Lazarus himself walked among his people in silence, with a stillness that spoke louder than words and no pride or boast. His very existence served as evidence, a living reminder of a force stronger than death. His life was the story, and he didn't have to tell it over and over again. Those who gazed into his eyes saw the echo of a mystery too profound to comprehend. In addition to the reflection of a man who had been restored, they could still see the tomb's shadow, but they could also feel the warmth of the light that had summoned him. Some were comforted by his gaze, while others were filled with trembling awe because he was the living proof that death was not the end. Once sobbing outside his house, the neighbors now came in with laughter, bread, and oil, amazed to see him. Frequently, they would say, "Lazarus, you are here." They touched his hand as if they needed to confirm that this was real. Others whispered to him, "How was it?" And even though he didn't often provide lengthy responses, his silence had impact, as if certain mysteries weren't meant to be solved by human speech. His steady breathing, his serene smile, and his pause were sufficient. People's hearts were stirred in ways they couldn't quite explain, and they departed with a sense of reverence. Youngsters ran around him with unrestrained joy. pulling at his robe and giggling as they played, because to them he was not only a wonder, but also a friend. Come full circle. The village elders observed him thoughtfully, reflecting on their own mortality and wondering about the invisible hand that had saved him. And because of the rumors that had made it to Jerusalem and then to other places, travelers, merchants, pilgrims, and seekers came from outside Bethany's boundaries. They crowded the winding streets, sat close to his doorway, and asked for directions to his house in the hopes of catching a glimpse. When Mary and Martha saw their brother walking in the daylight, their hearts grew with silent appreciation. Every second seemed borrowed to them, and every word he said was like a gift placed carefully in their hands. Because she was aware of the miracle sitting across from her, Martha frequently found herself setting the table more carefully than before. During meals, every time she looked at Lazarus, Mary, who had poured perfume at Jesus' feet out of devotion, found her heart overflowing not with expensive presents, but with silent gratitude. Once trembling with grief, their home now reverberated with a joy so profound that not even the darkness of sorrow could quell it. But even in happiness, there was a somber undertone. The miracle marked the start of a greater awareness rather than a resurrection, as if nothing had occurred. Lazarus lived his days in an almost otherworldly calm, free from distraction or hurry. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was as though his words were carefully considered, and each one held a fragment of eternity. His guests departed with the impression that they had come into contact with something sacred and extraordinary. Not everyone who arrived was filled with awe. Some arrived suspiciously, their questions tinged with uncertainty and their eyes keen. They looked at Lazarus as if looking for a weakness, something that would make them reject the miracle as a hoax or a ruse. But he stayed calm, not combative, not defensive, just present. Without argument, his existence disproved their skepticism. Many people were uneasy about that silent testimony because there was no compelling enough argument to keep the truth about his life from coming to light. Bethany felt both happy and burdened by the large number of guests. The formerly peaceful village became bustling as voices filled the streets and strangers were welcomed into the homes. Even in the midst of the chaos, there was respect because the miracle had affected not just one family, but the entire community. The olive trees continued to whisper in the wind, as they always had, as if to guard the mystery that was developing among them. And Bethany returned to silence in the evenings when the guests had left and the stars had risen. The nights were sacred to Lazarus. He frequently sat outside under the open sky, the cool air surrounding him and the village silence encroaching. He would take deep breaths while gazing up at the stars, each one serving as a reminder of the gift he had received. Perhaps more than anyone else, he understood the strength of the one who held life and its fragility. Even though he didn't talk about the tomb very often, the quiet of those times seemed to contain echoes of what he had experienced. Darkness, stillness, and then the voice that called his name with a power that could have pierced death. The wonder never grew old to the jailed people of Bethany. Some returned time and time again, drawn not only to see Lazarus but also to experience the closeness of the miracle that surrounded him. It wasn't intentional. It was just the fact that he lived there that made his house a gathering spot. In his presence, hearts softened, meals lasted longer, and prayers had greater significance. In addition to its olive groves, Bethany gained notoriety for the man who lived after death. There was no need for speeches, banners, or proclamations during this silent testimony. In the soft smile of a man who was once restrained in gloomy garments, but is now free to walk in the sun, the truth was lived in flesh and breath. Many people found that just seeing Lazarus was enough to rekindle their faith and hope that the one who raised him was in control of everything, including death. With their hearts lifted, they left Bethany with the story not as a rumor, but as a witness, because they had personally witnessed the man who had once walked in silence, now walking in peace. As time passed, the influx of tourists never really stopped. Others arrived with questions, others with restless uneasiness, and still others with joy. Lazarus, however, stayed the same, calm, steady, and unflinching, knowing that his life was now a testimony for others to read and not just his own. He accepted the miracle with humility rather than conceit. Everyone who entered felt the weight of Bethany's existence, which was a gentle but unmistakable reminder that life goes on after death. Neither the tomb nor the quiet days that followed in Bethany marked the end of Lazarus's story. His life evolved from a personal miracle to a living symbol, a subdued yet significant premonition of something much bigger that was still to come. Lazarus's return was not the fullness of what Jesus came to bring, but each breath he took after, being called forth, served as a reminder that death itself could be reversed. Lazarus had been called back into the frail web of earthly existence, shackled by time once more and doomed to die. However, like a lantern pointing toward an unexplored horizon, Jesus' resurrection indicated that he would completely defeat death, not just for one person, but for everyone who believed. There was awe in the air for those who watched Lazarus emerge from the tomb in Bethany, still wrapped in his burial garments. However, it was also full of questions that they were still unable to articulate. How could that have occurred? What was the force behind the voice that evoked life from death? What did it mean for the world, the future, and the very fabric of life and death itself if Jesus could accomplish this for Lazarus? The miracle sowed the seeds of mystery and faith, which would only blossom at another tomb outside of Jerusalem. The land was rapidly filled with whispers. People whispered about Bethany in the synagogues, the marketplaces, and the streets of Jerusalem. Lazarus, according to some, was unquestionably evidence that Jesus was more than just a teacher and prophet, possibly even the long-awaited Messiah. Others struggled with discomfort as the implications pushed against the boundaries of their comprehension. What was he going to do if he could bring the dead back to life? There was an implicit feeling that this was not the end of the story, but rather the start of something even bigger that permeated every discussion, rumor, and breath of wonder. Lazarus himself appeared to represent this foreshadowing in the silence of Bethany. As a man, he experienced mortality twice, once in silence and once in undoing. His presence among the living served as a reminder to everyone that Jesus possessed a power that no one else had ever claimed. However, there were hints of incompleteness in even Lazarus's life. He was not changed. He had been restored. He still had the limitations of flesh, still experienced hunger, and still felt exhausted after a long day. Although it was brief, his resurrection was real, amazing, and miraculous. The promise of a resurrection, not another frail life, but life forever, was hidden in that very reality. As they processed what they had witnessed, the disciples themselves started to realize the significance of what they had witnessed. Wonder and uneasiness stirred in their hearts. They recalled what Jesus said to Martha, "I am the life and the resurrection." Lazarus was evidence of those words, but not their fulfillment. "He who believes in me, though he dies, yet shall he live." It seemed as if the teacher had offered them a preview, an initial taste, of the larger feast that lay ahead. Lazarus's raising served as a marker for the journey to Golgotha, a stone-carved tomb, and a morning when the stone would be rolled away, not for a man who had been called back, but for the Son who had defeated death, though their hearts were moved in ways they were unable to describe. The people of Bethany were still unable to fully comprehend it. Every visitor who gazed into Lazarus's eyes was left wondering about eternity. Expectations were raised with each repetition of the story. Even those who feared, resisted, and hardened their hearts against the miracle had to face it. How could anyone deny the indisputable fact that a man who had been dead was now alive? Like a shadow cast by something bigger, something approaching. That reality pushed forward. Lazarus's tale was paradoxical in many respects. His miraculous comeback served as a reminder to everyone who gave it much thought that he would eventually die again. The grave clothes that had once bound him were now loose, but they would be needed again someday. Even though his family was very happy, they were also quietly aware that this gift was temporary. The foreshadowing was contained in that paradox, because it directed everyone's attention toward a higher hope. Could death yield forever in a way that no tomb could ever undo if it had already yielded once at Jesus' command? The raising of Lazarus served as a landmark along the way, a source of both hope and trepidation as the last week in Jerusalem approached. It gave Jesus' followers more faith and the confidence to think that even the most devastating loss could be reversed. It caused great anxiety among the leaders who opposed him because they perceived in it an uncontrollable power and a warning that their authority was in jeopardy. In addition to blessing a family, the Bethany miracle started the chain of events that would culminate in a cross. The shadows of resistance grew deeper throughout the country in the happiness of one household, beyond the joy and the fears. However, there was a deeper thread subtly woven throughout the narrative. The voice that summoned Lazarus was the same voice that would soon erupt from the cross and break the stillness of his own tomb. The Bethany miracle was not a singular act of kindness. Rather, it was a piece of a larger picture of redemption, with every moment echoing toward the ultimate triumph and every thread pointing forward. Lazarus rose at Jesus' command, but Jesus would rise on his own initiative, never to die again, and bring with him the promise of eternal life for everyone who believed. The connection became evident to those who looked back later, following the discovery of Christ's empty tomb. Like the dawn before sunrise, the tale of Lazarus was a soft light that foreshadowed the glory to come. It was an indication of Jesus' intention to completely eradicate death as well as his authority over it, though it was a glimpse of the larger resurrection that would reshape both history and eternity. What had transpired in Bethany was also symbolic. Lazarus thus lived as a sign and a man. The promise of eternity weighed on his feet as he walked Bethany's dusty streets. His restored but still precarious life was a testament to a hope that extended beyond his personal narrative. And more than the memory of a miracle, those who came to see him touched his hand and muttered his name in wonder took with them a hint of resurrection itself, a silent but indisputable expectation of the day when death would be forever engulfed. In triumph, the true essence of faith is revealed in the darkest valleys, despite the fact that it is frequently described as a light, a guiding force in the shadows. Faith becomes less about what is seen and more about what is trusted when everything appears uncertain and the heart is burdened by grief, doubt, or fear. It is a soft whisper informing the soul that it is not alone, not a loud voice pleading for attention. During the silent moments of grief, when tears flow more easily than words, faith becomes a steady hand that is invisible but profoundly felt. It stabilizes the soul by tying it to a reality that is more profound than circumstance, but it does not always provide answers to the questions that are bothering the mind or take away the pain. In many respects, the Lazarus story reflected this kind of faith. Before the miracle was made public, Martha told Jesus with shaky honesty, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Her words were full of sorrow, but there was also a glimmer of hope. Even though she was still unable to fully understand what he intended to accomplish, she thought that his presence might have had an impact. Mary, in her brokenness, expressed faith in the only way she could, by crying at his feet, her tears combining anguish and reverence. Although their trust was genuine, it was not flawless or devoid of doubts. It was the kind of faith that perseveres through the night in the expectation of an undiscovered dawn, the kind of faith that reaches toward God even when the heart is doubtful. During difficult times, faith frequently feels brittle. Quiet perseverance that won't let go is more often than not the audacious confidence that makes a bold declaration without hesitation. It clings despite trembling and stumbling. Like a candle that flickers in the wind, it endures because the one who lit it is watching over it, not because it is unshaken. Because it is addressed to the one who hears, even when words fail and the heart can only groan in silence. That groan itself turns into an act of trust. The people at Lazarus's tomb battled the conflict between hope and mourning, between possibility and finality. Their grief was profound, but something more was evoked in Jesus' presence, a dim realization that even in death, everything was not lost. To believe in what is not yet visible is to have faith in the midst of darkness. It involves moving forward even though the way ahead is obscured, having faith that the person calling you forward is aware of the best course. It is to find solace in the knowledge that God is close, even when that closeness is imperceptible. Faith is a means of bearing suffering with hope, not a means of escaping it. Jesus did not condemn the mourners' tears or brush off their sorrow when he shared in their tears. Rather, he stepped into it, demonstrating that faith does not imply that grief will not exist, but rather that grief will not have the last say. Through his tears, he demonstrated how faith itself is woven with divine compassion. Faith has a silent power that comes to the surface only when everything else has failed. Faith endures when resources run out, when friends are unable to console, and when solutions fall apart. It grounds the heart in something timeless and bigger than situation. In Bethany, Mary, Martha, and the disciples' faith was put to the test, tethered between hopelessness and hope, but ultimately it testified to a more profound reality. They discovered that having faith does not entail knowing every aspect of God's plan. Rather, it entails having faith in His heart even when it is unknown. It is a trust that arises from the certainty of God's identity rather than from the certainty of the result. Such trust can grow stronger during difficult times. The shepherd's presence is most valuable in the valley. His voice is most calming in the storm, and his power over life is most evident in the tomb. Lazarus' resurrection demonstrated that even when faith appears to be unanswered, it is not wasted. Mary and Martha had been waiting for days, wondering why Jesus had taken so long. They believed that the delay meant that there was no more hope. However, in the mystery of God's timing, the delay was intentional rather than the result of neglect. It prepared them to witness a miracle that would last forever by stretching their faith beyond what they could comprehend. Faith takes on a similar form in our individual journeys. It helps us get through difficult times, but it doesn't always protect us from them. It enables us to wait when answers seem far off, to hope when despair closes in, and to breathe when grief feels like it will suffocate us. Faith whispers that there is a voice powerful enough to summon life beyond the tomb's silence, and that even the darkest night is not forever. It serves as a reminder that the one who writes the ending of our story holds it together, not what we can see. Putting our brittle trust in hands much stronger than our own is what it means to rest in faith. This means that even though I don't understand, I will continue to believe. I'll follow even if I can't see the way. This faith does not come easily, nor does it take away the struggle, but it turns the struggle into a place of encounter. I feel the weight of sorrow, but I will not allow it to drown my hope. The soul learns to rely on God's unwavering love rather than its own strength as His presence approaches during the waiting. The crying and the long nights of uncertainty. The miracle of Lazarus evolved from a historical occurrence to a living reflection on faith in general. Those who witnessed it were reminded that faith is a solid foundation in divine power rather than a flimsy hope in human strength. Faith dares to think that death is not the end and sees beyond the grave. It endures in the dark because God's light shines even brighter against it, not because the darkness is less real. Bethany's faith was fulfilled in witnessing that sorrow change rather than in avoiding it. And faith remains the soft strength that carries the soul toward. Mourning in every heart that endures the night. Soft tones are frequently used when discussing love, as if it were only a temporary emotion or a source of comfort. However, the love that was made visible in Jesus was anything but brittle. It was a love powerful enough to go into the depths of sorrow, to cry with broken hearts, and to question even death's finality. That love was made evident to the world at Bethany, outside of Lazarus' tomb. It was love that was expressed not just in words, but also in a voice that had strength, beyond death, and in tears that trickled silently down his cheeks. In addition to being a miracle worker, he was also a friend, a brother, and a savior whose love transcended compassion and was demonstrated by deeds. Jesus demonstrated that divine love is not indifferent to human suffering when he stood among the mourners and shed his own tears. Instead of approaching with aloof authority and concealing his feelings, he decided to let his heart be seen. His tears were a heartfelt expression of solidarity with those who were suffering, not a sign of weakness. In its purest form, love engages with grief, shares it, and bears it with the bereaved rather than just watching it from a distance. Jesus showed us the heart of God through his tears, a heart that is touched by human sorrow and that weeps with the broken. The lesson learned from that moment at the tomb is that divine love is intensely intimate, tender, and caring rather than abstract. But tears were not the end of his love. Love that merely expresses grief without taking action is still unfinished. Jesus' love was fiercely powerful and incredibly compassionate. He shared Martha's, Mary's, and the other's sorrows before making a commanding approach to the tomb. In addition to being a show of strength, his order to roll away the stone was also a sign of love that would not allow Lazarus to fall into the hands of death. Divine love calls forth life from within the valley of shadows, not just providing solace. Jesus declared that love is greater than grief, despair, and even the weight of death. With each step he took toward that sealed cave, his love was felt by Mary and Martha in ways that were both tender and overwhelming. He gave Martha hope beyond her wildest expectations when he spoke of life and resurrection. Mary felt comforted to know that her suffering was acknowledged and respected when he shared tears with her. And his love broke the limits of what appeared possible when he called Lazarus forth. For the sisters, divine love was more than just a concept. It was the force that turned their worst day into a celebration of life. They learned then that love has the ability to completely change the course of events rather than just providing solace to lessen the pain of loss. The effect of that love was felt by the crowd as well. Others stood in wonder when Lazarus came back to life, while others were moved by his tears and murmured to one another, "See how he loved him." They had seen the weight of divine love, whether they fully understood it or not. It is an active, not passive, shallow, but incalculable love. They witnessed a love that could simultaneously contain sorrow and triumph in the blending of his humanity and divinity. Such love is incomprehensible, yet it speaks to the core of every human heart because it satisfies the most fundamental need, the need to know that we are not alone, even when we are dying. It is a fact for every day, not just the one day in Bethany. That love is stronger than death. The greater reality of Christ's mission, where love would finally face death on the cross, was hinted at by the miracle of Lazarus. His command to Lazarus to come forth foreshadowed his own resurrection, where death itself would be vanquished once and for all, and his tears at Lazarus' tomb foreshadowed the deeper grief he would bear at Calvary. The story's beating heart is the same in both scenes. Love so powerful that it defies death's final judgment. The knowledge that the same love still exists today provides solace to those who reflect on this tale. The picture of Jesus crying serves as a reminder that he is not far away during difficult times when words are insufficient and silence is oppressive. He shares our tears, feels our pain, and gets close. His love gives us life and serves as a reminder that there is still hope. When all else seems lost and the stone feels too heavy to move, divine love gives our tired hearts courage, whispers of a dawn beyond the night, and holds us when we cannot hold ourselves. In the hands of Christ, love is unwavering despite the common perception that it is delicate and brittle. It lifts the weary, it embraces the forgotten, it enters tombs, and it endures storms. Love that is stronger than death is not unaffected by grief. Rather, it is love that turns grief into hope. It redeems pain rather than erasing it. It promises a more expansive reality beyond loss without discounting its reality. That love was made evident in Bethany through Lazarus' resurrection, but it still reverberates in every tale of faith, every instance of grace touching a life, and every heart rejuvenated by hope. Finding serenity in the midst of darkness is what it means to rest in such love. It is to know that there is someone nearby whose love never wavers, even in the stillness of the tomb. It is to believe that in ways we cannot yet fathom, life will be restored, prayers will be heard, and tears will be seen. Although love that is stronger than death does not guarantee that we will never experience loss or grief, it does reassure us that these experiences are temporary, that grief is not the end, and that death cannot separate us from God's love. Witnessing Jesus' love is awe-inspiring, as the people of Bethany discovered that day. His love is strong, unending, and triumphant. It does not falter under pressure or wane with time. Every time he performed a miracle or shed a tear, his love was made evident as the most powerful force in the universe, one that unites creation and leads people to salvation. The core of the gospel and the story of Lazarus is love greater than death, which serves as a reminder that love will ultimately triumph. One of the few things that unites all people is grief. The weight of loss eventually finds its way into the heart, regardless of one's birthplace, faith, or path. The tale of Lazarus demonstrates that grief carried the same intense pain as it does now, even in biblical times. When Mary and Martha wept over the death of their brother, their voices echoed the same questions that mourners of all ages whispered. Why did this happen? Was there a way to stop it? In this silence, where is God? Their tears were no more dissimilar from those shed in the silence of a home emptied by absence, at the graveside, or in hospital rooms. We start to see our own reflections when we pause to observe the grief in their story. There were cries of lament mixed with longing and despair in the air of that village of Bethany. When Lazarus took his last breath, the sisters' world fell apart. They had prayed for healing and hoped for a miracle. Anyone who has lost a loved one is familiar with that collapse. Grief enters without warning, changes everything, and doesn't ask for permission. The once shared table feels empty. The once bright laughter turns into a painful memory, and the ordinary moments that were once overlooked now sting with the acute edge of absence. Mary, sobbing as she falls at Jesus' feet, reminds us of times when grief has brought us to our knees and all we can do is pray with tears. Time slows down when you're grieving. The days feel heavy, the hours seem longer, and the future seems uncertain. In the 4 days that passed between Lazarus' death and Jesus' arrival, Mary and Martha must have experienced the same weight. 4 days of waiting, silence, and attempting to cope with the indescribable fact that the person they loved was no longer there. Those days are familiar to many people who grieve today. An empty room's silence can be oppressive. While the clock continues to tick, the heart does not. The past is repeatedly reenacted in those moments. Every smile remembered with both thankfulness and longing, every memory treasured and yet painful. We learn from grief that love and pain are intertwined, and that the depth of sorrow frequently reflects the depth of a shared love. The human side of grief includes both the questions and the pain. Martha's was straightforward. Lord, my brother would not have died if you had been here. How many times have we heard such a cry in contemporary hearts? If onlys, those brittle expressions that simultaneously convey regret, bewilderment, and longing are common in the landscape of grief. Examples include, if only the doctors had acted sooner, if only I had seen the signs, and if only God had intervened. It is consoling to see such queries in the Bible because it serves as a reminder that uncertainty and sorrow are normal human emotions rather than indications of a lack of faith. Martha and Mary were grieving even in Jesus' presence. Their grief was genuine and they were free to ask questions, even though there was hope. These days, grieving is frequently handled discreetly and behind closed doors. Even though their hearts are exploding on the inside, people go about their lives, smile politely, and claim to be fine. The grief was more obvious in Bethany. The house was visited by mourners who wailed and walked with the sisters in theirs. Grief, it was shared, communal, and nearly public. The human pain is the same despite the differences in customs. Grief has the same weight in all cultures and eras, regardless of whether it is expressed through vocal sobs or silent tears. People getting together with food, stories, or prayers can provide solace to some. Others find solace in being by themselves, in sitting in silence and reflecting on their past. Both relate to those old tales of grief and hope, and they both represent the human side of loss. Grief also has a peculiar rhythm, with tears and laughter frequently occurring simultaneously. At a wake, a story may be told that makes people laugh out loud, but then silence falls as the loved one's absence hits once more. Even though their hearts ached at his absence, Mary and Martha undoubtedly recalled happy times spent with Lazarus, such as meals together or evenings spent in conversation. Many people are familiar with this paradox, how joy and pain frequently converge, and how love endures even in the face of grief. Grief is never tidy or well organized. It always bears traces of the lost love, but it comes in waves, sometimes tiny, sometimes overwhelming. The account of Jesus weeping is consoling to those who have experienced the valley of grief. It demonstrates that crying is a normal aspect of love and not a sign of weakness. Weeping is a way to honor the connection that death cannot break and to recognize the worth of the departed. Tears are sacred in all cultures. They bridge the gap between time and place and are the language of grief when words cannot express it. Jesus' tears serve as a reminder that even God experiences grief. He joins us in it rather than standing above it and gazing down with icy disinterest. This reality changes mourning from a solitary experience to one that is shared by someone whose love transcends loss. Distances separating families, medical facilities taking the place of homebound farewells, and the solitude of online condolences. Rather than bustling gatherings are just a few of the new difficulties that come with modern grief. However, despite these modifications, the core is still the same. A friend mourns a friend, a spouse mourns a spouse, and a mother mourns a child. The photograph on the wall, the vacant chair, and the unanswered phone all communicate with the key of the tomb in Bethany. Grief today is not all that different from grief back then. It is the same human experience with the same desire for solace, hope, and the knowledge that love will always be there. The fact that hope and grief can coexist is arguably one of the most important lessons to be learned from the Lazarus story. Jesus did not chastise Mary and Martha for their grief. He didn't tell them to stop crying. Despite knowing that Lazarus would rise again, he joined them in their tears. In doing so, he demonstrated that even in cases where one's faith is strong, grief does not have to be concealed or denied. At the same time, we can grieve and hope, weep and believe, ache and trust. The human side of grief is an honest display of love rather than weakness, and it is via this honesty that healing gradually starts. Knowing that grief is not exclusive to oneself can be consoling to those listening, who may be harboring silent memories of their own losses. It is passed down through families, time, and the vast history of humanity. Jesus' tears serve as a reminder that love endures even in the darkest places, and Bethany's grief serves as a mirror of our own. The love that unites us to the people we miss is not broken by grief, even though it may bend us. We bear the evidence of love, a love that grief cannot take away, in every tear we shed, in every memory we treasure, in every desire for reunion the soul has always been burdened by. Darkness. Every step is uncertain because of the lack of clarity, the shadow that hides paths, and the veil. The tomb is the most obvious representation of that darkness in the Lazarus story. These are the physical manifestations of mortality's last word. A sealed stone, a dead body, and a silence too heavy to ignore. The mourners saw no possibility when they gazed upon that tomb. They witnessed the end, the fading of light, and the sobering reminder that death shuts the door that no hand can open again, regardless of how much one loves. The darkness that descends when all hope is lost was symbolized by the tomb. But the light of resurrection was about to shine into that very darkness. Shadows can be effortlessly undone by light. The first rays of dawn have the power to change an entire landscape, and a single flame can push back the night. Jesus brought a light that was brighter than any candle or sunrise with him when he stood in front of the tomb. His presence transformed the hopelessness rather than negating it. The stone served as both a barrier and a portal for the revelation of glory. The tomb's quiet was temporary. It was awaiting the authoritative voice that would resurrect life. The great drama of life itself is depicted in this contrast, the conflict between light and dark, hope and despair, endings and fresh starts. The crushing force of darkness was felt by everyone present that day. They murmured about the decay, the stench, and the impossibility of going back. Realism, a human evaluation of what could and could not be done, permeated their words. However, faith frequently calls us to believe that light is stronger than what our eyes can perceive and to see beyond what can be quantified. The words, "I am the resurrection and the life," spoken by Jesus himself, cut through despair like rays of light piercing storm clouds. By demonstrating that light can now shine into even the darkest corners of life, he was not only giving hope for a future resurrection, but also bringing that power into the here and now. Death is only one aspect of darkness. It also refers to all the locations where hopelessness resides. It's the illness that never goes away, the loneliness that won't go away, and the regrets that keep coming back to you. It's the shattered dreams, the broken relationships, and the silent nights spent wondering if anything will change. The tomb becomes a metaphor for the heart itself in these situations, heavy, sealed, and resonating with the echoes of the past. However, the tale of Lazarus serves as a reminder that light can reach any tomb. The voice of Christ has the ability to call life back and open doors that seem to be permanently closed, regardless of how long the shadows have persisted. More than just a physical act, the stone rolling away signified that light had come where darkness had previously prevailed. The act of opening the tomb and allowing light and air to touch what had been concealed reflected the way hope starts to erode into despair. The first signs of rebirth frequently appear subtly, a kind word, a prayer, or a memory that brings consolation rather than suffering. These insignificant moments open the door for grace to enter, much like the stone being moved. Light does not fear what it comes into contact with, but darkness may object, claiming that the stench of loss is too strong. It changes, rejuvenates, and restores wholeness. Between these two realities hung the crowd that gathered around the tomb. On the one hand, all they saw in their eyes was death and darkness. However, they heard Jesus' words, which offered a glimmer of hope, commanded faith, and promised life. Anyone who has experienced grief or despair is familiar with this tension. Between the weight of reality and the glimmer of promise, between what we see and what we hope for, is where we stand. Faith develops in this very tension because it is here that one must decide whether to accept the darkness or hold on to the hope that light is still possible. The tomb is symbolic of everything that is closed, final, and unchangeable. Everything that has been reborn, opened, and changed is symbolized by resurrection. The two come into contact here, and their collision alters humanity's perception of both for all time. Neither the power of the tomb nor the reality of death are denied in the story. Rather, it shows that there is a light that is unbeatable even in the darkest places. Death is not the end, but it is real. Though it is not permanent, darkness is heavy. Even though the tomb is sealed, divine intervention is still possible. This symbolism's beauty goes well beyond Bethany's hillside. Every human heart has experienced both hopelessness and rebirth, as well as darkness and light. Our fears, failures, sorrows, and seemingly unhealed wounds are the shadows of our own graves. However, the tale of Lazarus illuminates those gloomy areas, reminding us that Christ's presence illuminates the very areas we once believed to be permanently dark. Renewal can start right now, in the silent moments of faith when we dare to think that the stone can be rolled away in our own lives. It is not only for the future that nature itself bears witness to this cycle of light and dark. The earth is kept in a tomb of frost during the winter, but spring brings life and blossoms. The world is shrouded in darkness at night, but morning always brings fresh light. Before sprouting into life, seeds are concealed in the shadows and buried in the ground. The truth that was revealed at Lazarus' tomb, that life resists death, that light always triumphs over darkness, and that renewal arises from endings, seems to be echoed throughout creation. These recurring themes serve as a reminder that Bethany's miracle was a glimpse into a more profound reality that permeates all aspects of life rather than a singular incident. For those present, Lazarus' resurrection became the indisputable proof that hope could not be dashed. Joy would soon follow tears. Faith would grow where there was despair, and life would resurrect where death existed. Once representing the finality of loss, the tomb was transformed into a location where divine glory was revealed. Light's voice was louder than darkness's, which had just finished speaking. The contrast between the tomb and resurrection, darkness and light, and hopelessness and renewal is still evident when we think back on this particular moment. These themes are present in every human heart and are not merely taken from an old tale. Every day, we have the option of listening to the voice of Christ, which calls us to life, or the voice of despair, which declares that the tomb is final. And when we choose, we discover that there is always light waiting to rise. Even in the darkest night, every human life has times when the heart feels like a tomb, with stones too heavy to move and sealed inside. The spirit is pressed down until it feels as if life has been drained away by grief, disappointment, guilt, or the wounds of betrayal. There are chambers of silence where hope seems extinguished, and people carry burdens that few ever see in those quiet, hidden places. Despite having historical roots, The story of Lazarus transcends its narrative of a single man's resurrection and instead serves as a metaphor for the soul's internal journey and resurrection. The heart yearns to hear a call that reawakens what was once dead within, just as Lazarus heard his name spoken by an unavoidable voice of authority. The renewal of the heart and the gradual, healing rebirth of life where only shadows once existed are the essence of inner resurrection. The human spirit frequently endures unseen suffering. Laughter can conceal loneliness, activity can conceal soul exhaustion, and a smile can conceal a wound. However, beneath the surface, the heart's chambers might resemble that shadowy tomb silent, concealed and sealed by the stones of agony. Every failure memory, rejection statement, and unresolved grief accumulates into a wall that appears immovable like a layer of rock. Nevertheless, the power to stand before such tombs and command life to return lies in the presence of divine love. Renewal entails changing what has been endured rather than erasing it, letting light where darkness has prevailed. Christ's voice calling Lazarus forth was more than just a call to breathe again. It was a statement that death was not the ultimate authority. The same idea applies inwardly to people who are feeling hopeless. Something deep within is stirred by the voice of faith, which whispers into the emptiness of grief. As with Lazarus's journey into the light, renewal may not occur immediately, but it starts subtly with the slightest glimmer of hope. The indications of resurrection within the heart include the conviction that life may still have meaning, a glimmer of courage to face the future, or the comforting knowledge that one is not alone. The inner tomb slowly opens, the heavy stone shifting slightly to allow light to enter. Often, personal healing necessitates confronting our fears. Before the miracle could happen, Lazarus's tomb had to be opened and the stone removed. The heart must also be prepared to face the innermost depths of grief or suffering. It can be frightening to expose oneself, as if the stench of past hurts will overpower you. However, the voice cannot call us out unless the tomb is opened. When the heart dares to be open and vulnerable, allowing the divine presence to reach into the brokenness and touch what is hidden, healing begins. Resurrection within us is made possible during these times of surrender, when we run the risk of allowing the stone to be moved. Rejuvenating the heart involves both transformation and healing from loss. What once burdened the soul can now serve as the basis for resilience, wisdom, and compassion. A person's inner resurrection serves as a lighthouse for those who are still ensnared in their own darkness, much like Lazarus's resurrection served as a testimony for others. The scent of resurrection is carried by those who come out of sorrow with greater faith, from failure with greater humility, or from grief with greater tenderness. Others perceive in them the potential for light to penetrate even into their own graves. The profound reality of inner renewal is reflected in this silent testimony, which was born out of living rather than preaching. Learning to breathe again in the areas where we previously suffocated is another aspect of inner resurrection. The spirit is frequently suffocated by regret, anxiety, and shame, which bind it like Lazarus's burial garments. These restrictions are loosened during the healing process, restoring the soul's freedom of movement. Christ's voice did more than just call out to Lazarus. It also said, "Unbind him and let him go." Similarly, the journey of the heart entails release, freedom from resentment, from guilt, and from the never-ending rehearsal of what might have been. The spirit is given more freedom to live in the fullness of light with each release. which is like a strip of cloth falling away. Scars cannot be removed by personal healing. Lazarus still carried the memory of the tomb even though he was alive again. Scars, however, don't have to be a sign of failure. They can serve as indicators of survival and a testament to the challenges faced. Internally, scars serve as a reminder to the soul of resiliency and the fact that light triumphed over darkness. These reminders become symbols of strength rather than burdens for the heart. Being renewed means evolving through the pain rather than going back to our pre-pain selves. Inner resurrection transforms who we are, making us more profound, compassionate, and sensitive to life's mysteries, much like Lazarus emerged from the tomb into a life that was irrevocably altered. The silence of the tomb is mirrored in the silence of the heart prior to renewal. When the chaos of grief has subsided and the soul is at rest, healing frequently starts in silence. Although this quiet may seem oppressive, even intolerable, invisible changes are occurring within it. The heart must be still before renewal can occur, just as seeds must lie hidden in the ground before they sprout. Inner resurrection is a slow process that gradually restores what seemed lost. The steady rhythm of fresh breath, renewed purpose, and renewed joy replaces the tomb's silence. Light not only renews, but also reroutes when it enters the heart. Lazarus's life after death was never the same, and people who undergo inward resurrection frequently discover that their course changes. Values grow, priorities shift, and the soul yearns to live more authentically. The eternal gains clarity, while the trivial loses its impact. Since the heart no longer holds on to what has been lost, but instead welcomes what is being given again, this rerouting is a necessary component of the healing process. Renewal is more than just restoration. It's a gateway to a life that is more receptive to grace, love, and thankfulness. The lesson of Lazarus is that resurrection starts in the present and is not limited to the last day. Every act of bravery, every moment of forgiveness, and every step toward hope is an internal resurrection. After being sealed and silenced, the heart learns to sing once more. Once heavy and shackled, the spirit learns to dance freely. Renewal turns into a daily routine, an ongoing summoning of life from our inner tombs. We are reminded that darkness is not the end by the resounding voice of Christ, even in the midst of grief. As the sun set and the coolness of night spread across the hills, the village of Bethany fell into silence. The inner resurrection of the heart is a testament that light is always stronger, that healing is always possible, and that life can always begin again. Under the moonlight, the stones that once gleamed in the golden light of the day now turned silver. Inside modest houses, tiny lamps flickered, their light blending with the pale glimmer of starlight above and leaking dimly through wooden shutters. The aromas of olive groves and the lingering smoke of evening fires filled the quiet air. It was the kind of silence that comes after a long day, filled with a deep, peaceful breath, not lifeless or empty, as if the very act of creation were taking a pause. Beneath the stars, Bethany, with its meandering streets and modest homes, seemed to sigh softly. Neighbors talked quietly in their houses about the wonders of the previous days in the stillness, their voices reduced to whispers. Some whispered back to themselves what they had witnessed, astonished once more at the impossibility of a man emerging from his tomb. Others remained silent, not because they couldn't believe it, but rather because they were in awe. The night turned into a veil that enveloped these thoughts, holding them in silence until they were taken by sleep. Even the animals appeared to be in a state of tameness. The sheep huddled in their pens, the donkeys were silent under their roofs, and the dogs were curled up close to thresholds, their ears perking but not barking. The sky was wide and endless above it all. The stars were clear and steady, illuminating the pathways between houses with subtle glimmers that only a village away from the smoke of the city could understand. The heavens seemed alive to those who were awake, as if the stars themselves were bending closer, bearing witness to a tale too sacred for casual conversation during the day. Some of the villagers looked up, resting on doorways or rooftops, feeling small under the boundless canopy, yet also knowing their place in it. Their rest was deepened when night reminded them that the same God who had called a man back from death was also the one who controlled the stars, the light from the oil lamps. In Lazarus's house poured into the courtyard, where the aroma of bread and herbs continued to permeate the air. Inside, with their hearts full of thanks, Mary and Martha whispered to each other. They were tender and fragile, but rooted in wonder, as the shock of joy and the tiredness of crying had not yet completely subsided. Even though he was quiet, Lazarus sat among them with the composure of someone who had ventured into the unknown and come back. The soft sound of his breathing, the rhythm of life restored, was a hymn more potent than words, so his presence was sufficient. Every heartbeat in that house echoed eternity, and the night felt sacred, as if time slowed down outside. The disciples lingered, some lounging by olive trees and others sitting along the low stone walls that surrounded the paths. Though they spoke softly and with a reverence that matched the hour's silence, they whispered of the miracle they had seen. Above them, the constellations drew shapes that shepherds and travelers were accustomed to seeing, while the earth beneath them was firm and grounding, and the cool night air touched their skin. Although the disciples were aware that what they had witnessed would leave a lasting impression on them, they also sensed that the mystery was growing deeper and posing questions that they were still unable to address. They just lay there for the time being, allowing the silence to seep into their bones as Bethany's night grew quiet. The fields surrounding the village remained untouched, with the olive branches barely moving in the light wind that blew over the hills. The moon's soft light softened the long, deep shadows. Every path appeared surreal, as if it had been illuminated by something other than light from the earth. Bethany's night was not dark. Rather, it was bright, full of a subdued brightness that seemed to hum with peace, hope, and renewal. Knowing that they lived in a place impacted by the extraordinary gave the villagers comfort as they drifted off to sleep, carrying these whispers into their dreams. Youngsters, exhausted from the excitement of the long day, fell asleep more readily than usual, their dreams blending with the tales they had heard. The line between the ordinary and the miraculous became hazy in their imaginations. In their dreams, they might see hands reaching into the dark to pull someone out, hear voices calling across silence, or see light streaming from a tomb. Their innocence held a faith that adults occasionally lost, and they would wake up in the morning with questions on their lips. Even their dreams were shrouded in awe by the night of Bethany. Silence grew thicker as the hours passed, covering the hills like a blanket. One by one, the lamps went out, their flames flickering feebly before giving way to the darkness. Shadows moved softly, as if the entire village swayed in time with the sky as the moon traced its arc across the sky, sprinkling rooftops with silver. Time seemed to be slipping away from those who were still conscious, as if the barrier between the everyday and the eternal had become pliable. Prayer rose more readily in such silence, whispered into the still air, words too faint for human ears but understood by the divine. The night evolved into more than just the absence of daylight. It became a hallowed period of time during which people could rest and breathe freely. Lying on his bed, Lazarus gazed up at the dark ceiling. The weariness of someone who had gone through something incomprehensible was evident in his body. However, he was unable to adequately describe the clarity with which his spirit was alive. Every moment was full of significance, and every breath felt like a gift. Closing his eyes, he listened to the subtle symphony of life, not to silence, but to the distant rustle of leaves, the faint cry of a night bird, and the steady beat of his heart. Once so commonplace, these sounds now seemed to have a sacred quality. The night in Bethany was more than just a rest period for Lazarus. It was a continuation of the miracle and a reminder that life had returned where it had not been anticipated, in the soft embrace of silence and starlight. The village continued to sleep. At night, Bethany transformed into a serene place where the day's dust settled, hearts grew softer, and awe permeated the atmosphere like incense. As if the entire village now breathed in unison, resting under the watchful eye of heaven. The miracle of life, still new and unfathomable, deepened the silence rather than broke it. The ancient and eternal stars above appeared to shine brighter, as though they were grinning down on the small village that had evolved into the arena of divine might. The people of Bethany lay in their beds that peaceful night, some with tears still streaming down their cheeks and others with joy still warming their chests. They were all enshrouded in the same tender truth, that in the quiet of the night, life had triumphed over death, and that peace had entered their hearts. Step by step, you have accompanied me on this silent retelling from the silence of grief to the brightness of life restored. When we heard the moving words that broke through the finality of death, we both lingered at the sealed tomb, feeling the weight of silence pressing against the air. We saw the stone roll away, heard the authoritative voice, and witnessed Lazarus emerge alive despite being clothed, a testament to the unwavering power and love of God. We listened to the whispers of those who found it difficult to comprehend, felt the wonder of the disciples as their faith grew, and shared in Mary and Martha's tears. In addition to the miracle of Lazarus, we discovered in this story a mirror of our own inner desires for peace and rejuvenation, as we followed the darkness of sorrow and then the light of hope. At night, the village of Bethany reminded us of the silence that comes after awe, the silence that allows the heart to freely breathe. May that same silence envelop you as you rest tonight. May the knowledge that love is stronger than grief, that faith gets us through even the darkest valleys, and that light always rises again even after the longest night calm your heart. You are recognized, loved, and held in an unwavering love, just as Lazarus was called by name. Let that truth serve as your comfort. Quell the agitated thoughts that occasionally keep you from falling asleep, and soften the edges of your worries. Breathe slowly and deeply, as if you were letting your soul rest in the tender embrace of divine presence, letting go of the burden of the day, and breathing in the tranquility of Bethany's night. I hope you fall asleep the way Mary and Martha must have, their hearts calmed, their tears dried, and a presence stronger than fear filled their home. May you be reminded that every heartbeat is a gift by the silent delight of Lazarus's breath echoing in your own. I hope that your dreams are filled with glimmering hope, and that you awaken in the morning feeling rejuvenated and armed with the same certainty that no darkness has the last say. I encourage you to stay in touch if this journey has been a blessing to you tonight. If this story has helped you find peace, please like it. Leave a comment below with your thoughts and subscribe for more heart-resting stories, and allow your eyes and ears to return here, where silence and narrative collide, when you're ready for another peaceful and cozy evening. Till then, may you be surrounded by peace, may you be rested, and may you have a restful, peaceful, and blessed nights. Sleep